The mud was cold, and it smelled like rain and wet roots, and the particular kind of earth that only exists at 2 in the morning when nobody else is awake to smell it. Maren Voss was on her knees in it. She had been in this position for 11 minutes. She knew because she had counted, the way she always counted when she was doing something that required her not to think about what she was doing. Counting kept the panic somewhere behind a door. Counting kept her hands steady. She had her carved wooden stamp pressed into the soft ground beside the border trail, and she was making paw prints. Wolf paw prints. Hers. Except they were not hers, not exactly. She had carved the stamp from a piece of oak 3 years ago, working by candlelight in her small house at the edge of the Pack settlement, shaving the wood with a blade until the shape was right, until it matched the prints left by a mature female wolf, until the pad depth and the claw spacing looked like something that had been pressed there by something alive and powerful and whole. She pressed the stamp once, lifted it, shifted it forward by the right distance, pressed again. She had memorized the stride length of a wolf her size. She had studied it for weeks, following other pack members into the forest after shifts, measuring the gaps between their prints with a piece of string, writing the numbers in a small notebook that she kept under a loose floorboard. The notebook was full of numbers like that: stride lengths, print widths, the angle of claw marks at a walking pace versus a running pace, the difference in soil displacement between a wolf that weighed 120 pounds and one that weighed 140. Maren weighed 126 pounds. She had calibrated the stamp accordingly. This was her Tuesday routine, and her Thursday routine, and sometimes her Saturday routine, depending on whether the Border Patrol had left clear tracks for her to study. She made the prints along the outer edge of Pack territory, just inside the boundary markers, following the path that a patrolling wolf would naturally take. She made them look purposeful. She made them look like someone who belonged here had passed through. She made them look like her. The version of her that could shift. The version of her that had never existed. She finished the last section of the trail and sat back on her heels, pushing the stamp into the front pocket of her jacket. Her knees were wet. Her hands were filthy. There was a smear of dark mud on her left cheek where she had pushed her hair away from her face without thinking, and she would not discover this until she got home and looked in the mirror and thought briefly that she looked like someone who had been through something. Which was not entirely wrong. She stood up and turned to head back toward the settlement. The patrol wolf was 6 feet away. She had not heard him come. That was the thing about wolves. Even in their human form, they moved through forest the way water moved through sand, without effort, without announcement, without any sound that her ordinary human ears could catch. He was standing on the trail ahead of her, half in shadow, his dark hair pushed back from his face, his eyes reflecting the thin moonlight with that particular quality that her eyes never had and never would. His name was Owen. She knew Owen. Owen was 22, quiet, steady, the kind of man who nodded instead of speaking in most situations. He had been on the Border Patrol rotation for about 8 months. He had never given her any particular trouble. He was also standing close enough to see the mud on her knees. Neither of them moved for a moment. Maren's hand was in her jacket pocket, wrapped around the wooden stamp. She was gripping it so hard that she felt a ridge of wood pressing into the center of her palm. She kept her face completely still. She was very good at keeping her face still. She had been practicing that since she was 6 years old. Maren, Owen said. Owen, she said. He looked at her, he looked at her knees. He looked at the trail behind her, at the section she had just come from, where her boot prints and the stamped wolf prints existed together in the mud in a way that, if examined with any real attention, would tell a story she could not afford to have told. Then he looked back at her face. Late night, he said. Couldn't sleep, she said, walked too far. You know how it is. He did know how it was, or he would have known in the ordinary sense if he were the kind of person who struggled to sleep. Maren did not know if Owen struggled to sleep. She did not know Owen well enough to know his sleep habits. She knew that he was on the Tuesday night patrol. She knew that he was 7 minutes early tonight, which had nearly ruined her. 7 minutes? She had given herself a 15-minute buffer, and he had eaten most of it without even trying. You're out late, he said, and it was not quite a question. I like the dark, she said, which was true, technically, for reasons that had nothing to do with this, and also true for reasons that had everything to do with this, because the dark was the only time she could do what she had just done without being seen. Owen was still looking at her. There was something in his expression that she could not read, which was unusual because she was very good at reading people. She had learned to read people the way a person who cannot swim learns to read water, carefully, from a distance, with an understanding that the wrong read could cost her everything. He stepped aside on the trail. "Watch yourself out here," he said. "Pack came through 2 nights ago from the Aldrich territory, Beta Scouts. They were looking at our border markings." This was new information, and it landed in her chest with a particular kind of weight. "Aldrich territory," she said, keeping her voice easy. "King's men," Owen said. He said it simply, without drama, the way you might say the weather looks different tonight, or there was an accident on the North Road. But his eyes had something in them when he said it, something careful, just routine, nothing to worry about. "Right," she said. "Nothing to worry about." She walked past him on the trail and kept walking until she was around the bend and into the thicker trees, and then she let out the breath she had been holding since she had looked up and seen him standing there, and it came out of her in a long, ragged rush that sounded embarrassingly close to relief. She walked home with mud on her knees and her hand in her pocket, and the stamp pressing a perfect circle into her palm. Her house was small. It sat at the edge of the settlement in a way that was technically inside the pack's residential boundary but felt, if you were honest about it, like it was considering leaving. The pack had given it to her when she was 18, when she had aged out of the communal housing where unmated Omegas lived, until they were claimed or confirmed or otherwise sorted into the pack's internal structure. She had been given the house at the edge because the houses in the middle were for wolves. She was not technically a wolf. She was a wolf in every legal and biological sense. Her father had been one, her mother had been one. The bloodline was clean, she had no human ancestry, no diluted heritage, nothing that should have produced an Omega who could not shift. The pack healer had confirmed this when she was 6, and then again when she was 9, and then again when she was 12, each confirmation delivered in a tone that got quieter each time, as if the healer was performing a task she had stopped expecting to yield good news. Maren had stopped expecting good news around the same time. She let herself in through the front door and pulled off her mud-covered boots and stood them by the step. She washed her hands at the kitchen sink. She saw her reflection in the dark window above the sink, the mud on her cheek, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, the particular set of her jaw that appeared whenever she was managing something. She was always managing something. She wiped the mud off her face with a dishcloth and went to bed. She did not sleep for a long time. She lay in the dark and thought about Owen's eyes when he had said King's men. She thought about the way he had stepped aside. She thought about what it meant that scouts from the Aldrich territory had been examining their border markings, and she thought about this for a long time before she was able to put it somewhere manageable. She had a system for manageable, she had a system for most things. The system for manageable was to put the worry in a box in her head and close the lid and tell herself she would open it in the morning, in the light, when she had more information and less cold mud on her knees. The system worked about 60% of the time. Tonight it worked in the general sense that she eventually fell asleep, but not before the thought she had been trying not to think had already thought itself. If the Alpha King was reviewing territories, every member of this pack would be expected to present. Every member, including the ones who had been making fake paw prints for 3 years. She woke up before her alarm, which was not unusual. She woke up before her alarm most days, a habit built from years of needing to be already moving before anyone else noticed she had not been moving the right way. Her body had simply decided at some point that early was safer than late. She made coffee. She stood at her kitchen window with the mug in both hands and looked at the early gray light coming through the trees. A bird she couldn't name was doing something complicated in one of the taller oaks. She watched it for a while. Her name was Maren Ella Voss. She was 24 years old. She had grown up in this pack, in this territory, in the communal housing with the other Omega children until she was 18, and she had watched every single one of them shift for the first time. She had watched Lily shift at 11 and been happy for her. She had watched Cal shift at 12 and been happy for him. She had watched even little Petra, who was nervous and small and cried about everything, shift at 13, and Maren had been happy for her too, genuinely happy, which was perhaps the most impressive thing she had ever done. Maren had not shifted. She had tried. Lord have mercy on her sorry paws, she had tried. She had tried alone in the forest, and she had tried in the healer's presence, and she had tried on the night of the full moon the way the old stories said it worked, standing barefoot in a clearing with her arms out like she was waiting for something to arrive. She had read every text she could find about delayed shifts. She had spoken to traveling healers who came through the territory once or twice a year. She had done everything except tell the pack leadership the truth, which was the one thing she could not do. The truth was that Maren Voss was an Omega who could not shift. And in a wolf pack, an Omega who could not shift was something the pack leadership had a word for. The word was liability. The word meant no border patrol duty. No hunting, no pack defense, no contribution to the territories that kept the pack fed and safe and intact. The word meant that you were fed and housed by the generosity of your pack's alpha and you gave nothing back, and there was a particular kind of conversation that pack alphas had about liabilities, and it ended with relocation or removal, or the kind of quiet, uncomfortable separation that everyone agreed was for the best. Maren had heard that conversation happen to someone else when she was 16. A man named Peter, quiet, gentle Peter, who had a medical condition that prevented him from shifting more than once a season. He had been sent to a sanctuary community 2 territories east. Everyone had said it was better for him. Everyone had said the sanctuary was a good place. Maren had never heard from Peter again. She had started carving the stamp the next week. It had taken her 4 attempts to get the size right. The first stamp was too large. It made prints that looked like they belonged to a male wolf twice her imagined size. The second was too small and the claw marks came out looking like a cub had pressed its paw into the earth. The third was better, but the pad spacing was wrong, and she had noticed, during one of her careful late-night studies, that her own prints could be laid beside the stamped ones and compared, and the comparison would not hold up. The 4th stamp was correct. She had tested it over and over on different soil types, dry, wet, packed, loose, until she could produce a print that would pass casual examination. She had told herself, when she made the first set of prints 3 years ago, that it was a temporary measure, that she would find a solution, that the shift was in there somewhere and she just needed more time. She still told herself that sometimes. She was getting less convinced by it. The coffee was finished. She rinsed the mug and set it by the sink and got dressed for the day. She had a job in the settlement's supply office, which meant she received and logged deliveries of food, tools, and materials that came in from trading partners outside the pack territory. It was not a glamorous job. It was paperwork and inventory counts and occasional arguments with delivery drivers about whether 17 bags of flour was actually 17 or 16 and a half. She was very good at it. Numbers were reliable. Numbers did not ask her to be something she was not. She walked to the supply office through the morning, nodding to the pack members she passed. Most of them nodded back, a few smiled. She had a good reputation here, steady, reliable, never dramatic about anything. The pack liked steady. The pack liked reliable. They did not need to know that the reliability came from 11 years of careful performance, each interaction calculated to present exactly enough to be accepted and never enough to be examined closely. Fletcher Cole was leaning against the outside wall of the supply office when she arrived. Fletcher was the pack beta, which meant he was second in authority under the alpha, which meant he had, among his many responsibilities, the job of overseeing border security and patrol scheduling, and the welfare of pack members who might be considered in any kind of distress. He was 30 years old. He was tall in the easy, unhurried way of men who have been tall since they were 14 and have made peace with it. He had brown eyes and a quiet face, and he was, under most circumstances, the most level-headed person in any room he entered. He was holding 2 paper cups of coffee. He held one out to her. She took it because she had not yet figured out how to decline things from Fletcher without it feeling complicated. "Morning," she said. "Morning," he said. He did not move away from the wall. Owen Greer was on the trail last night. Maren opened the supply office door. "I know," she said. "I saw him. He filed his patrol report at 5 this morning." Fletcher followed her inside, which was not unusual. He came into the supply office regularly, on pack business, which meant she could never tell whether any particular visit was actually about pack business or about something else. "Good for Owen," she said. She set the coffee on her desk and shrugged out of her jacket. "He noted irregular boot prints on the East Border Trail," Fletcher said. "Female, not a patrol member, in the area between markers 9 and 11. Maren sat down at her desk. Between markers 9 and 11 was where she had been working last night. That was the stretch she had stamped. That was the stretch where her boot prints were pressed into the mud alongside the carved wolf prints, in a combination that, if anyone bothered to follow the trail from one end to the other, would tell a very short and very clear story. "Sounds like someone was out for a walk," she said. Fletcher looked at her. She looked back at him. "Owen didn't file it as a concern," Fletcher said after a moment. "He filed it as a note, casual, just information." "Owen seems like a sensible man," Marin said. "He is," Fletcher agreed. He drank some of his coffee. He was still watching her with those level brown eyes, and she was still keeping her face completely still, which she was very good at, and which was becoming, in this particular moment, slightly harder than usual. "Fletcher," she said. "Marin," he said. "Was there something you needed from the supply office?" He set his paper cup down on the edge of her desk. He put both hands in his pockets. He looked for a moment like a man who was choosing between several things he might say and had not yet decided which one would do the least damage. "The Aldrich Territory sent a preliminary notice this morning," he said. "By rider, paper and ink, old form, the Alpha King is conducting a territorial review." Marin's hands were very still on the desk in front of her. "Dates," she said. 14 days, Fletcher said. "He'll be here in 14 days. She nodded slowly, as if this were regular information arriving at a regular pace, as if the floor under her chair was not doing something she could feel in her teeth. 14 days, she said. "He'll want to meet the pack," Fletcher said, "all of it." And there it was. All of it. She picked up her coffee. She drank from it. It was good coffee, which she noticed in the distant way that you notice good coffee when you have just been informed that your entire carefully constructed life has a deadline attached to it. "I'll update the supply logs," she said. Fletcher picked up his cup. He looked at her for one more moment. He did not say what he was thinking, which was the thing about Fletcher. He almost never said what he was thinking, and she almost always knew what he was thinking anyway, and they had an unspoken agreement not to make this into something that either of them had to manage out loud. "I'll see you at the afternoon briefing," he said. "I'll be there," she said. He left. She sat at her desk with the coffee going cold in her hands and thought about 14 days, and she thought about Owen's careful eyes on the trail last night, and she thought about the wooden stamp in her jacket pocket, and she thought about Peter, quiet, gentle Peter, who had been sent east and never heard from again. Then she opened her inventory log. Numbers were reliable. Numbers did not ask her to be something she was not. She started counting. She found it on a Wednesday. Not found exactly. Stumbled into it, the way you stumble into something you have been carefully walking around for long enough that your feet have memorized the route, and then one day the route is closed, and you walk straight into the thing you have been avoiding. It was in the inspection logbook. The pack kept physical inspection logs, real paper, real ink, real signatures, because the Alpha had a philosophy about physical records being harder to alter than digital ones, and this was true enough that nobody had ever seriously argued with it. The logs lived in a cabinet in the patrol office, which was a small room attached to the back of the community hall, and Marin had access to it in her capacity as supply coordinator, because the inspection logs included records of supply deliveries that came in through the border stations, and her job required her to cross-reference those entries. She had been doing this cross-referencing on a routine Wednesday when she turned to the page for the previous month and found her name. It was crossed out. Not scratched out, not obscured, not marked with any kind of official correction symbol, just drawn through with a single horizontal line, cleanly, in the way you crossed out a line in a draft when you had decided it was not working. And beside the crossed-out name, in the column that should have contained her patrol confirmation signature, which she had never provided because she did not have a patrol confirmation to provide, because she was not on the border patrol, because she could not do border patrol work in the way that a shifting wolf could do border patrol work, there was a checkmark. A neat, small, clean checkmark. In different handwriting. She knew the handwriting. She had seen it on briefing notes and assignment schedules and the kind of dry administrative paperwork that moved through her office on a regular basis. She had seen it on the courier notice about the Alpha King's visit, which she had read 3 times, and then folded and put at the back of her middle desk drawer where she was not looking at it. Fletcher Cole's handwriting was very distinctive. He wrote with the careful, slightly compressed letters of someone who had been trained to take precise notes and had never quite shaken the habit. The checkmark was his. Maren stood in the patrol office for a moment, the logbook open in her hands, and looked at the crossed-out name and the checkmark beside it. Then she turned back one more page, the month before that. She found her name again crossed out, the same clean single line, the same checkmark in the confirmation column. She turned back another page, same. 8 months of pages. 8 months of her name crossed out, and Fletcher's checkmark replacing it. 8 months of someone quietly, carefully, without ever saying a word about it, making sure that the absence of her patrol confirmation did not appear in the official record as an absence. She closed the logbook and put it back in the cabinet, and walked out of the patrol office and back across the community hall and out into the morning air. And she stood there for a moment with her hands at her sides, and the sun doing something bright and inconsiderate above the trees. Why would he do that? She ran through the possibilities the way she ran through anything that did not immediately make sense, methodically, from one end to the other, testing each one for weight. He had done it by accident. No, 8 months was not an accident. 8 months was a decision made repeatedly, on purpose, every time the logbook was reviewed. He had done it because it was administrative tidiness, and he had not thought about what it meant. Also, no, Fletcher did not do things without thinking about what they meant. It was, arguably, the defining feature of his personality. He had done it because he wanted something from her in return. She left this one open and turned it over a few times. It was the most obvious explanation. People covered for other people because they were owed something or expected to be owed something. This was the most common shape of human motivation, and she had no reason to think Fletcher was immune to it. Except that he had not mentioned it. For 8 months. If this was a debt being created, it was being created with extraordinary patience, and without any sign that the collector expected to collect. She went back to her office. She sat down at her desk. She stared at the wall for a while. The wall was not helpful. Fletcher appeared in her doorway at 11:30. He was holding a folder of paperwork, actual pack business, the kind that required her signature on supply authorization forms, and he looked the same as he always looked, which was calm and level, and like someone who had decided some time ago that being unsettled was not worth the energy it cost. She looked at him. She looked at him for a moment longer than usual, which was different from how she normally looked at him, and she was aware of this, and she was also aware that he had registered the difference, because his eyes did a very small, very careful thing when she looked at him that way. "I was in the patrol office," she said. "I know," he said. He stepped into the room. He set the folder on her desk. He did not sit down because he rarely sat down in her office unless she indicated that the conversation was going to be long. He just stood there, folder on her desk, hands easy at his sides. 8 months, she said. "Yes," he said. She let a pause happen. She was good at letting pauses happen. Most people could not stand the silence and said something into it that they had not planned to say. Fletcher was one of the few people she had ever met who was better at silence than she was. He waited her out. She looked at the folder on her desk. She did not open it. She would open it in a minute after this, and she would go through the authorization forms with the same steady efficiency she brought to everything, but right now the folder was just an object on a desk, and she was looking at it because it was easier than looking at him. "Why?" she said. He did not pretend he did not know what she was asking. She appreciated that. "You'd have done the same," he said. She looked up at him. "No," she said, "I would not." She meant it. This was not false modesty or performance. She was honest enough with herself to know that 8 months of quiet, consistent, unclaimed cover was not something she would have thought to provide for someone else, because she was occupied, in every available corner of her attention, with providing it for herself. She did not have spare capacity for other people's secrets. "Maybe not," Fletcher said, and he said it like he was not entirely sure he believed her but was willing to let it go. "You could have told me," she said. "Would you have let me continue?" he said. She thought about this. Honest answer, no. Honest answer. She would have told him to stop, because a cover that someone else controlled was not a cover, It was a dependency, and dependencies were things that could be withdrawn, and things that could be withdrawn were things that she could not afford to have. "No," she said. "That's why I didn't tell you," he said. She looked at him again. She was trying to find the thing under the thing, the angle she was missing, the shape of what he wanted, because there was always a shape to what people wanted, and she was good at finding it. But Fletcher's face was the same as it always was, level and steady and giving her nothing extra. "The Alpha King is coming in 14 days, she said. "I know," he said. "A territorial review means full pack presentation," she said. "Every member. Documented." "I know," he said. She waited for him to say something else. He did not. He looked at her with those brown eyes and he waited. "Your checkmarks won't cover a pack presentation," she said. "No," he agreed, "they won't." "So what are we doing here, Fletcher? What has 8 months of checkmarks been building toward?" He was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of someone thinking about what to say, but the silence of someone who has already thought it, and is deciding whether now is the right moment. "I was buying you time," he said. "I'm still buying you time. What you do with it is your decision." She stared at him. 14 days is not a lot of time, she said. "No," he said. "And whatever you have been thinking I might do with that time, whatever you imagine might happen between now and the king's arrival." "I'm not imagining anything," he said, and his voice was quiet and even, and she believed him almost. "I'm not expecting anything. I'm not asking for anything. I want to be clear about that." "Then what do you want?" she said, and her voice came out a little sharper than she meant it to, a little less controlled, and she pressed it back down quickly, but she saw him register it. "I want you to still be here after the review," he said. Simply, without drama, like it was the most ordinary thing in the world to say. She looked at the folder on her desk again. She pulled it toward her and opened it. The authorization forms were straightforward: a supply order for winter stores, a delivery schedule for medical materials from the eastern trading posts, a request for additional fuel for the community hall through the cold months. All of it practical, all of it her job. She picked up her pen. "I need these back by 4, Fletcher said, and his voice had shifted back into its usual register: pack business, professional, easy. "They'll be ready by 3, she said. He nodded. He left. She worked through the forms with her usual efficiency, which was something she was grateful for, the way her hands knew what to do even when her head was doing something else. She signed her name 4 times. She noted the delivery dates. She flagged one order that had a pricing discrepancy and made a note to follow up with the trading post. She thought about checkmarks. She thought about the fact that Fletcher had been watching her carefully enough, for long enough, to know that her patrol confirmations were not appearing in the logbook. She thought about what it meant that he had noticed this and said nothing, had simply corrected it month after month with his neat compressed handwriting and a single small checkmark. She thought about what it meant that she felt something when she thought about that, and that the something was not quite gratitude and not quite fear, and sat somewhere between the two in a place she did not have a name for. She put the forms in the return folder and labeled it with Fletcher's name and set it at the edge of her desk. She had 14 days. She did not know what she was going to do with them, but she was going to do something, because she had been doing something for the last 11 years, and she was not built for the alternative. The alternative was giving up, and giving up was a thing she genuinely did not know how to do. It was not strength. She wanted to be clear with herself about this, in the privacy of her own head, because she had very few places left where she needed to be clear, and she wanted to preserve them. It was not strength that kept her trying. Strength was the thing other people had, the thing she saw in the pack members around her when they took on difficult work, and did it well. What she had was something more like stubbornness of a specific kind. The stubbornness of a person who has built an entire life out of a single daily decision, and does not know how to unmake the decision without unmaking the life along with it. She did not know how to not be this anymore. So she would keep being this for 14 more days. And then she would see. She was in the community garden at the back of the settlement that evening when Orna found her. Orna was 83 years old. She was the pack's oldest living member, which meant she was, in the social structure of the pack, the person most likely to have seen things that other people had not. She was also the pack elder in an official sense, which meant she had a role in significant pack ceremonies and decision-making that was difficult to quantify but was felt by everyone. She was, in Maren's experience, also the person most likely to be in any given place at the exact moment when Maren least wanted company. The community garden was behind the meeting hall, and in the evening it was usually quiet. The daytime workers had gone home, the evening meal had already been picked over, and what remained was the particular piece of a garden at dusk, when the light turned copper and the insects started their quiet work. Maren had taken to spending time here when she needed to think, because the act of being among growing things at the end of the day was one of the few things that turned the volume down on everything else. She was crouched by the late-season tomato plants, pulling small weeds from the base of the stems, when she heard the careful sound of Orna's walking stick on the path. Orna walked slowly, but she never walked uncertainly. There was a difference. She was nearly blind in both eyes now, but she navigated the settlement with the confidence of a woman who had memorized every stone of it 70 years ago and had not needed to see it clearly since. She stopped at the edge of the tomato bed. She tilted her head the way she sometimes did, that bird-like quality of attention, as if she were receiving information through channels that had nothing to do with her eyes. "Maren," she said. "Orna," Maren said. She did not stand up. Orna generally preferred that people did not leap to their feet when she arrived. It made her feel, she had said once, like a surprise inspection. "You smell like mud and worry," Orna said. "The mud I understand, the worry is newer." "I'm always worrying about something," Maren said. She pulled another small weed and turned it over in her fingers. "It's my natural state." "It is," Orna agreed pleasantly. She found the low bench at the edge of the garden by the same kind of internal navigation she used for everything, and she sat down on it with the careful ease of someone who has made peace with the fact that sitting down now takes a moment. She put her walking stick across her knees. She sat. Maren kept weeding. The evening went on around them, a bird in one of the far trees, the sound of someone's door closing across the settlement, the slow, living smell of the garden. "My mother had a cousin," Orna said, after a while, in the tone she used for stories that were not quite stories, that were observations wearing the costume of stories. "She could not shift until she was 27 years old." Maren's hands went still in the dirt. "Is that so?" she said. "Pack didn't know for the first few years," Orna said. "She was clever, very clever. You learn to be clever when the alternative is something you don't want to become." Maren looked at the tomato plant in front of her. It had a small crack in the lower stem that she had missed before, the kind of crack that would need support before the cold came. "What happened to her?" she said, "at 27. Orna made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite anything else. "She was angry one day," she said, "very angry about something entirely unrelated, a disagreement about land boundary with a man who should have known better." She paused. And she shifted right there in the middle of the argument, just became herself apparently, without trying. Maren had nothing to say to this. Orna turned her face toward Maren, and even though her eyes could not see with any clarity, there was something in that turned attention that was more precise than vision. She said it felt like she had been holding her breath for 27 years, Orna said, and then someone said something that made her too angry to hold it anymore. "Silence." Then Orna patted her own knee with one age-spotted hand, decisively, as if settling something. "The tomatoes need netting before the first frost," she said. "The birds have been at the tops." "I'll do it Thursday," Maren said. Her voice sounded, to her own ears, like it was coming from a reasonable distance. "Good girl," Orna said. She took up her walking stick and stood slowly with the same careful ease. "Sleep well, Maren." "You too, Orna," Maren said. Orna walked away along the path, her stick tapping on the stones, until she was gone around the corner of the hall. Maren sat in the garden for a long time after that. The light changed. The insects got louder. She put her fingers in the dirt and felt the cool of it, the particular texture of soil that had been worked and tended and was, because of that tending, alive in the way that only cared-for things were. She thought about a woman who had held her breath for 27 years. She thought about 14 days. She thought about anger, specifically, the question of whether she had enough of it, and what exactly it would need to find its way to the surface. Then she went home, and she sat on her kitchen floor with her back against the cabinet and her knees to her chest, and she held very still for a long time. She was good at holding still. She had been doing it her whole life. Sunday assembly happened in the main hall at 9 in the morning, which Maren had always thought was too early for anything that required communal feeling, but nobody had asked her opinion when the schedule was built, and so she arrived at 8:55 like everyone else and sat in the fourth row from the back, between a woman named Celia who smelled like lavender soap and an older man named Harold who had a habit of sighing during the formal portions. The assembly itself was not long. It covered PAC announcements, logistics for the coming week, updates from the Border Patrol, and any matters of communal concern that needed collective awareness. The Alpha, a solid and deliberate man named Garrett, ran it the way he ran most things, efficiently and without unnecessary performance. He had been Alpha for 12 years. The PAC trusted him. Maren trusted him too, in the specific way that she trusted any authority whose attention she needed to avoid. Today there was one matter of communal concern. Garrett mentioned the Alpha King's visit in the same tone he used to mention the supply schedule. 14 days, territorial review, standard process, every PAC member to present on the morning of the third day. He said it the way you said something when you wanted everyone to hear it clearly without anyone becoming agitated about it. The hall was very quiet while he said it. Not the quiet of people being calm, the quiet of people choosing, collectively, to perform calm while doing something else entirely behind their eyes. Maren watched them. She had a habit of watching how a group of people received information rather than just receiving it herself, because there was usually more in the watching than in the hearing. The people in the first 2 rows, senior PAC members, shifters who had been in this territory for decades, received the news with the kind of stillness that was actually settled. They had been through territorial reviews before. They knew what came next. The people in the middle rows were doing the thing that middle people always did, which was calibrating their reaction to the people around them. Looking sideways, adjusting, deciding what the correct response was and then having it. The people in the fourth row from the back had a range of reactions. Harold sighed. Celia's lavender soap smell became slightly sharper, which Maren had noticed was what happened with Celia when she was managing something. Her personal scent intensified in the upper registers, a signal Maren could perceive even without the enhanced wolf sense that would have made it obvious to everyone around her. Maren herself looked at her hands in her lap and thought about the folder of authorization forms she had returned to Fletcher the previous afternoon, and about Orna's story of the woman who held her breath for 27 years, and about the wooden stamp in her jacket pocket, which she had not removed since Tuesday because she was not ready to put it somewhere permanent. Garrett finished speaking. People began to move. The gathering up of coats, the low murmur of conversation resuming, the particular acoustic of a large room returning to normal noise from formal quiet. Maren began to gather her coat as well. A hand closed around her wrist. It was small and dry and warm, and it was very deliberate, and she looked up from her coat to find Orna standing beside her row. Maren had not heard her approach, which should not have been possible. Orna was 83, and her walking stick made a sound, and the hall floor was wood, and all wood floors in all buildings everywhere had a way of announcing people's footsteps. But Orna had arrived beside her without announcement, and now her hand was on Maren's wrist, and her head was tilted, and her near-blind eyes were half closed, and she looked for all the world like someone listening. Celia gave them both a polite glance and moved away. Harold sighed once more and also moved away. The row cleared around them and they were left in a small pocket of unoccupied space while the rest of the assembly dispersed. Orna did not speak. She held Maren's wrist and she tilted her head, and she listened to whatever it was she was listening to, with that bird-like precision that had always been unsettling in the best possible way, the way that very honest things were unsettling. Maren stayed still. This was not difficult. She was, as previously established, very good at staying still. She held her coat in her free hand, and she kept her face neutral, and she let Orna do whatever Orna was doing, because fighting it seemed both useless and rude, and she had always liked Orna in the way you liked people who told you hard truths without apology. The hold lasted a long time. Longer than a greeting, longer than a casual gesture, long enough that Maren became aware of the specific pressure of each of Orna's fingers on her wrist, The thumb on the inner side, the 4 fingers across the top, the slight warmth of the old woman's skin against her own. Then Orna let go. She said nothing. She looked at Maren's face for a moment, or looked in its direction, or did what passed for looking in her, and her expression was not pity. Maren had spent years cataloguing the face of pity so she could recognize it at a distance and respond before it landed, and this was not pity. This was something else, something that lived in the same neighborhood as grief but was not quite grief either. Compassion, maybe, the variety that did not require you to do anything about the thing you felt it for. Then Orna patted her hand, the same decisive pat she had made on her own knee in the garden. She said, "Your tomatoes will need netting this week." And she walked away. Maren stood in the emptying hall with her coat in her hand and the sensation of Orna's grip still warm on her wrist, and she thought, she knows. Not the thinking you do when you are working something out, the thinking you do when you have already worked it out and are now processing the fact that you have worked it out. Orna knew. She had known for longer than the garden conversation, maybe much longer. She was 83 years old and she had been in this pack for all of those years, and the most fundamental fact about an Omega who could not shift was that they smelled like absence, not a specific smell, an absence of smell, like a space on a shelf where a book should be. And Orna, whose other senses had sharpened over the decades to compensate for the dimming of her eyes, had probably smelled that absence the way you heard silence in a room where music had stopped. The question was what she was going to do with it. Maren spent the next 3 days waiting to find out. She worked, she ate, she slept in the same short, pragmatic stretches she always slept. She walked the long route to and from the supply office each morning, which added 12 minutes to the journey but took her past the outer gardens and the stand of birch trees that she had always found calming. The specific white of birch bark in morning light did something to the inside of her chest that she could not explain and had stopped trying to. On the second day, she ran into Owen Greer at the edge of the market square. He was buying something from a vegetable stall. He saw her. He nodded. She nodded back. They passed each other without stopping, which was the usual nature of their interactions, but she noticed that his nod carried something slightly different than usual, a second of held eye contact that lasted just past neutral and then released. He was not going to say anything. She understood this from that extra second. He had made his decision the night on the trail and he was not revisiting it, but he wanted her to know he had made it, which was its own kind of thing. She appreciated Owen Greer more than she had previously. On the third day, she was in her office working through a complicated discrepancy in the fuel delivery records when a knock came at her door, and she said come in expecting Fletcher or one of the supply team, and Orna appeared. Orna never knocked. She had not knocked in the garden. She had not knocked in the assembly hall. She had simply arrived in the way that very old people sometimes arrived, as if time itself had carried them to wherever they needed to be. The knock then was deliberate, a choice, an announcement. Maren closed the fuel ledger. "Come in," she said, though Orna was already coming in. Orna settled herself in the chair on the other side of Maren's desk, which was the chair that Fletcher sometimes used, and which Maren thought of privately as the complicated chair. She set her walking stick against the desk. She folded her hands in her lap. Maren waited. "Do you know why I am here?" Orna said. "Yes," Maren said. Orna looked at her. "Then we can skip the parts where we talk around it." "I would appreciate that," Maren said. Orna nodded. She unfolded her hands and folded them again, a small motion that in a younger person might have been fidgeting, but in Orna was something more like adjustment, like a musician settling into a seat before playing. "How long?" she said. "Always," Maren said. "I have never shifted." Orna received this without a visible reaction, which meant either that she had already known, or that she was very good at receiving things, or both. "And the tracks," Orna said. "On the border trail." Maren looked at the closed fuel ledger on her desk. "A stamp," she said, "carved from oak. I've been maintaining them for 3 years." The silence that followed was the kind that had texture to it, not an uncomfortable silence. The silence of a person receiving information and fitting it into a picture that they have been building for some time, adding the last pieces. "That is very determined," Orna said. "It kept me here," Maren said. "Yes," Orna said, "I can see that it would." She was quiet for a moment. "Does anyone else know?" Maren thought about Fletcher's checkmarks in the logbook. She thought about Owen on the trail. She thought about the way she would answer this honestly without compromising either of them. "I believe Fletcher may have suspicions," she said carefully. "And Owen Greer saw me near the border trail last week. He did not pursue it." Orna made a small sound. "Fletcher Cole has had more than suspicions for some time," she said. "He came to me 3 months ago." Maren went very still. 3 months ago. 3 months before that morning in the garden when Orna had told her about the cousin who held her breath for 27 years. 3 months before the tomatoes and the walking stick tapping on the path. "He was worried about you," Orna said. "He did not tell me specifics, but he asked me if I had ever encountered an Omega whose shift was delayed, significantly delayed." "And what did you tell him?" Maren said. "I told him about my mother's cousin," Orna said. Maren looked at the wall. "So the story in the garden was true," Orna said firmly. "Every word of it was true. I have never told anyone a story that was not true. It was also, I will admit, a story I chose to tell at a particular time for a particular reason. Because Fletcher asked you to." "Because Fletcher was worried about you," Orna said. "And he had already decided to protect you without knowing what he was protecting you from. And I thought it was time that someone gave you something to hold on to besides that wooden stamp of yours." Maren looked down at her hands on the desk. She had not been aware that she was holding onto anything particularly hard, but her fingers were pressed flat against the desk surface in a way that looked, now that she noticed it, very much like someone gripping something. She lifted them. She set them in her lap instead. "The Alpha King's Review," she said. "Yes," Orna said. "I cannot avoid it," Maren said. "No," Orna agreed, "you cannot. And when he arrives, when the presentation happens, he will know immediately." "He will know," Orna said. "He has more experience with this than our Alpha has. Our Alpha has never encountered an unshifted wolf in his 12 years. Corin Aldrich has been reviewing territories for 8 years. He has encountered things. He has a fuller picture of what is possible." Maren filed away the name, Corin Aldrich, the Alpha King. She had known the name in the abstract way you knew the name of a distant authority, a title attached to a territory, a signature at the bottom of official notices. It had not previously felt like the name of a person who would, in 11 days, stand in her pack's assembly ground and look at her. "What does he do," Maren said, "when he finds something like this?" Orna was quiet for a moment. "That," she said, "depends on the thing and the finding and the man who finds it." Maren nodded. This was not reassuring. It was, however, honest, and she would take honest over reassuring on any given day of the week, which was perhaps the most genuinely wolf thing about her, even if the wolf itself had never arrived. "Is there anything I should do?" she said. "Between now and then, is there anything that would help?" Orna tilted her head again, that bird-like angle. "Your mother's cousin," Orna said. "I told you she shifted when she was angry. That was true. What I did not tell you was that she spent the years before that being angry about the wrong things. Small things, things she could control. She was so busy being angry about what she could reach that she never got angry enough about what she couldn't." Maren sat with this. "What was she angry about?" she said. "When she shifted." Orna's expression did something complicated. "Someone told her that she was not what she was," Orna said, not unkindly but clearly. "They told her that whatever she was, it was not a wolf and she should stop pretending otherwise." A pause. She shifted in the middle of that sentence. Maren thought about this for a long time after Orna left. She sat in her office with the afternoon light moving across her desk, and she thought about the specific kind of anger that came from being told you were not what you were. She had been told that, in various ways, since she was 6 years old. By healers and by the quiet mechanics of pack life, and by the space that other people occupied without noticing, the easy belonging of people who had never had to think about whether they belonged. She had gotten angry about it, of course she had. But the anger had always been the kind she could manage. The kind she folded away, same as the worry, into the box with the lid, in the part of her head she kept tidy because tidy was survivable. Maybe that was the problem. Maybe the box needed to be opened. Maybe the anger needed to stop being a managed thing and start being something else. Something that was not contained. something that she let out at full volume in the direction of whoever or whatever was standing closest when the lid finally came off. She did not know. She did not know how to do that deliberately. She was not sure anyone did. She picked up the fuel ledger and opened it again and found the discrepancy she had been tracking, and she worked through it with her usual steady efficiency, because the day still had work in it, and the work still needed doing, and she was, above all things, a person who completed the task in front of her before she allowed herself to think about the next one. But in the back of her mind, behind the numbers and the delivery dates and the logistics of who owed what to whom, she was thinking about boxes with lids. About what happened when you stopped holding one shut. About a woman she had never met, in a story she had been told for a reason, who had become herself in the middle of an argument without trying, with no warning to either herself or the man standing across from her. She thought about that for a long time. Then she locked up her office, put on her jacket and walked home through the birch trees, and the white of them in the late afternoon light did the thing it always did to her chest, and she let it. She was going to need everything she had for what was coming. She did not know yet what form that was going to take. But she was not going to leave it in the box. The messenger arrived at dawn. Not the particular dawn that makes people go outside to look at the sky. The earlier kind, the gray pre-light that arrives before color, when the world is still in the middle of deciding what it is going to look like today. The kind of dawn that no reasonable person should be moving around in unless they have no choice. The knock on her door was 3 times, precise and unhurried, the knock of someone who has been trained to knock in a way that is not alarming, but is also impossible to sleep through. Maren was already awake. She had been awake since 4, which was not unusual, but today she had been awake in a different way than usual. Usually when she woke at 4, it was because her body had decided that sleeping was finished, and she might as well get up and do something with the extra hours. Today she had woken at 4 because she was lying in the dark thinking about Orna's story and Fletcher's checkmarks and the Alpha King's name, Corin Aldrich, which had a particular quality to it she could not stop turning over. It did not sound like a name designed to put people at ease. It sounded like a name that existed in official documents and had consequences. She got up and answered the door in her socks and the sweater she had fallen asleep in, which was not ideal but was at least clean. The messenger was a young man she did not know pack-marked, wearing a formal riding coat that suggested he had come from somewhere else, which she could also tell from the faint smell of different earth that came off his boots. He was holding an envelope. Not a paper envelope, a formal one. Thick cream paper, sealed with the Aldrich Pax mark pressed in dark wax. He held it out. She took it. Response is not required, he said. Acknowledgement if you would. She understood this. She was a supply coordinator and she had managed hundreds of deliveries and knew what formal acknowledgement looked like. She found a piece of paper and a pen from the table inside the door and wrote her name and the date and the time and handed it back to him. He nodded and left. She closed the door and stood with the envelope in her hand. The supply office had already received the general notice about the review, the official communication to pack leadership that had come 5 days ago, that Fletcher had mentioned, that Garrett had relayed at assembly. That had been a collective notice. A pack-wide communication. This was addressed to her by name. She broke the seal. She read it once quickly, with the particular speed of someone who reads fast, because they have learned that the content of difficult things does not improve with slow reading. Then she read it again slowly. Then she sat down on the floor. Not deliberately. Her knees simply did the thing that knees did sometimes when the information coming in exceeded the structural capacity for managing it upright, and she was on the floor before she had made any decision about being on the floor, and she stayed there because standing up again was an action that required intention, and she had temporarily used all her intention on reading the letter. The messenger was still at the door in the sense that she could hear his footsteps on the path outside, the particular sound of someone beginning to leave. She should have said something. She should have called out. But the door was closed and she was on the floor and the letter was in her hand, and the messenger was going to be gone in another 30 seconds regardless. She let him go. The letter was from the office of the Alpha King. It confirmed the territorial review dates, which she had already known. It confirmed the requirement for all pack members to attend the formal presentation on the morning of the third day, which she had already known. It confirmed that the review would include individual wellness assessments for each member, which would be conducted by the king's attending healer in advance of the main presentation, which she had not known. Individual wellness assessments. Each member. This was new. She had been managing the main presentation. She had been turning the main presentation over in her head since the general notice arrived, calculating the geometry of it, hundreds of people, rows, a formal setting, the king moving through them, the brief attention of his notice on each face before moving to the next. She had been building a plan around that geometry. Something about the middle of the crowd, the third row, the use of bulk to create cover, the way that large-scale attention worked differently from individual attention. An individual wellness assessment was not bulk. An individual wellness assessment was a healer, alone in a room with her. A healer trained by the Alpha King's court. A healer who would, in the quiet of that room, do exactly what Orna had done in the assembly hall, tilt their head and listen to the space where her wolf should be. She sat on the floor and looked at the letter. She started a mental inventory, the way she always started a mental inventory when the situation required it. She listed every problem in order, and beside each problem she listed the options available to address it. Problem 1, the wellness assessment. Options, there was one and it was not good. She could go sick. She could manufacture an illness convincing enough to excuse her from the individual assessment without drawing additional attention. She was not good at faking illness. She was, by her nature, relentlessly healthy, and she had no track record of illness to draw from, which meant a sudden sickness this close to the king's visit would look exactly like what it was. Problem 2, the main presentation. Now understanding that any individual she encountered would potentially see what the healer would see. Options, she had none that she had not already discarded. Problem 3, 14 days had become 11 days, and 11 days had a different weight to it than 14. Options, she had been working on this one, Orna's story, the woman who held her breath, the question of whether she could, in 11 days, find whatever it was that had been blocked for 24 years. She had been trying to shift since she was 6 years old. She understood, with the particular understanding of someone who has been failing at the same thing for 18 years, that trying harder in 11 days was not a strategy. You did not succeed at something after 18 years of failure by deciding to try harder. If trying were the mechanism, she would have shifted at 7, at 10. At any of the thousands of nights she had stood in the forest and waited and tried and come home with mud on her knees and nothing to show for it. The woman in Orna's story had not shifted because she tried harder. She had shifted because something broke open. Maren folded the letter. She folded it into smaller and smaller squares, making the creases sharp and precise, until it was the size of a sugar packet. Then she held it in her palm and looked at it. She had been managing herself for 24 years. Every emotion kept in its box, every fear catalogued and contained, every anger acknowledged and folded away. She had built a system so efficient that she barely noticed any more, the way you stopped noticing a sound in your house after you had lived with it long enough. The background hum of keeping everything controlled, everything measured, everything in a place where it could be managed. The letter in her palm. 11 days. She got off the floor. She got off the floor because sitting on it was not going to produce anything useful, and she was, despite everything, fundamentally practical. She got up and put the kettle on and made tea, and she stood at the kitchen window with the tea in her hands and looked at the gray morning light coming through the trees. A bird was doing something in the oak again, possibly the same bird from the week before. She did not know enough about birds to know whether this was reasonable. She needed to tell Fletcher. This was not a comfortable thought, but it was a correct thought, and she had a long practice of following correct thoughts into uncomfortable places. She needed to tell him about the individual wellness assessment, because if anyone had information about how that assessment worked, what it involved, what a healer trained by the Alpha King's court would actually do in that room, it was Fletcher, whose job was to know things like this. She also needed to tell him because she had been running alone for 24 years, and she was, with 11 days left of the life she had built, aware that alone was a choice she had made for reasons that made sense, and was now, possibly, a choice that no longer served the function it had been built for. She was not good at needing people. She was going to have to get better at it, faster than felt comfortable. She went to work. The morning at the supply office was routine in the way that routine things sometimes were when your life was doing something large and difficult in the background. The mundane simply continued, because it always continued, because the world did not pause for personal crisis, and the deliveries arrived on schedule regardless of what you were managing internally. A shipment of dried grain came in from the eastern farms at 8. She logged it and counted the bags and discovered they were one short and filed a follow-up notice. A delivery of medical supplies arrived at 10, and she logged those too and checked the temperature seals on the storage containers and made sure the inventory matched the shipping manifest. At 11, Fletcher appeared. He did not bring coffee this time. He stood in the doorway with his hands in his pockets and looked at her, and she looked at him, and she understood that he had already been told about the wellness assessments, because he had the face of someone who has been told something they were already worried about. "Come in," she said. "Close the door." He came in and closed the door and stood on the other side of her desk. "Individual assessments," he said. "Yes," she said. "That is not standard protocol for a territorial review," he said. "No," she agreed, "it is not. It has been added specifically to this review. The notice came to PAC leadership at first light." He paused, along with the personal notice which was sent to all members, she finished, or to specific members. Fletcher looked at her. "I received one," she said. "Did others?" "I am still confirming," he said, "but from what I have gathered this morning, you are the only individual member to have received a personal notice." Marin sat with this for a moment. "He already knows something," she said. Fletcher nodded slowly, without indicating which particular something he thought might already be known. "Fletcher," she said, "is there any part of this, any part of the last 8 months, or anything that Orna may have said to PAC leadership, or anything from Owen's patrol report, that could have reached the Aldrich territory ahead of the official notice?" Fletcher was quiet for a moment. "Owen's report went to PAC leadership only," he said. "Garrett's reports to the Aldrich territory are quarterly and structured. There is nothing in the last quarterly report that would flag an individual member." He paused. "However, the scouts who came through 3 weeks ago were senior scouts. Their job is not just to look at boundary markers." "What is their job?" "To assess PAC composition," he said, "PAC health, whether the territory's member count aligns with what the records show, whether the energy of the PAC is what it should be." "The energy," she said. "Wolves feel it," Fletcher said, and he said it without any particular edge, just as information. "A PAC without a member's full presence registers differently, like a chord with a missing note. Most alphas can feel it if they are paying attention. A senior scout trained by the Aldrich court would have felt it in 3 weeks ago," she said. "They may have," he said. Marin looked at her desk. She looked at the perfectly organized surface of it, the logs in their proper place, the pens lined up, the small cup where she kept the supply office stamp, the framed map of PAC territory on the wall behind Fletcher's shoulder. All of it orderly, all of it maintained by the same system she applied to everything. "So he may have been planning this assessment since the scouts returned," she said, "which means the personal notice to me is not an accident." "That would be my reading, yes," Fletcher said. "He's coming for me specifically." Fletcher made a small sound that was not quite agreement and not quite disagreement. "He is coming for the review," he said carefully. "You are a notable feature of what he expects to find." She appreciated that. She appreciated the care of it. She also understood that notable feature was a very Fletcher way of saying that the alpha king of the most powerful PAC in the region was arriving in 11 days with a specific interest in a woman who had been faking wolf tracks for 3 years. "All right," she said. "All right," Fletcher said. "I need to know everything you know about Corin Aldrich," she said. "Not from the formal notices, the real things, how he conducts reviews, what he has done in similar situations, what kind of man he is when the formal language falls away." Fletcher looked at her for a moment. He looked like he was reassessing something about the conversation, recalibrating a position he had come in with. "He is known for being thorough," he said, "more thorough than most. Reviews that other kings complete in 2 days, he takes 4 or 5. He asks questions that other kings do not think to ask." "What kind of questions?" The kind that assume the person being asked has already thought through every comfortable answer and discarded it, Fletcher said. He is not trying to catch people, he is trying to understand things. There is a difference. Is there a difference in the outcome? Fletcher paused. Sometimes, he said, for the person being questioned sometimes. She nodded. She thought about this for the rest of the day. She thought about a man who asked questions that assumed you had already discarded the comfortable answers. She thought about what questions like that felt like from the inside, the specific quality of being seen past the surface you had prepared and into the actual content below it. She had spent 24 years ensuring nobody got that far. And now someone was coming who, by profession and apparently by nature, did exactly that. She went home that evening by the long way past the birch trees, and she stood among them for a while in the last of the afternoon light. The bark was very white. The leaves were thinning toward autumn, the first of them on the ground, and they were the color of old letters. She stood there until the light was gone. Then she went home. She put the folded letter in her kitchen drawer with her extra keys and the small notebook she kept of numbers she might need to reference, and she sat at the kitchen table and put her hands flat on the surface and looked at them for a while. These were the hands that had carved the stamp. These were the hands that had pressed it into the mud of the border trail twice a week for 3 years. These were the hands that had signed her name in logbooks and authorization forms and every piece of administrative record that existed in this pack for 11 years, and not one of those signatures had ever been challenged, because she was reliable and she was steady, and she showed up, and she did her job, and nobody looked at her hands. She did not know what the king would see when he looked at them. She did not know what he would see when he looked at her. She knew what she would do when he did. She would hold still, the way she always held still. And she would see what happened next. It was not a plan. She was the first to admit that it was not a plan. It was more like the last thing standing after all the plans had been removed one by one, which was not the same as a plan, but was sometimes all you had left, and she had made enough of those moments in her life to know that they sometimes led somewhere. Not always, but sometimes. She went to bed with the light still on, which she never did, and she lay there under it for a while before she reached up and turned it off. In the dark, she thought about the Alpha King. She thought about what it meant to be understood by someone with no reason to be kind about it. She thought about 11 days. Then she went to sleep. 6 days before the Alpha King's arrival, Fletcher came to her house. Not the supply office, her house. He had been there before twice, once to drop off a document that had arrived after office hours and needed her signature, and once during a heavy snowstorm 2 winters ago when a supply emergency had required coordination at 7 in the morning before either of them had been to work. Both times he had stood at the door, completed the business, and left. This time he knocked and then stood back a step, which she understood as a deliberate signal that this was different from those other times. He was giving her room to close the door if she needed to. She did not close the door. She said, "Come in." He came in and stood in her kitchen, which was small and clean, and had the particular order of a space arranged by someone who did not like to look for things. The morning light came through the window over the sink. She had been sitting at the kitchen table when he knocked, eating an apple, because she had been hungry and apples were what she had. She sat back down at the table. She took another bite of the apple. Fletcher sat down across from her. He sat down in the unhurried way he did everything, and he put his hands on the table, and he looked at her with the level attention that was, she had decided some time ago, his most defining quality. He paid attention the way very few people did, without distraction, without the overlay of his own reaction, just the clean fact of attention. "I have something to say," he said. "Say it," she said. He was quiet for a moment, not hesitating, choosing. "If you present as a mated omega," he said, "the assessment protocol changes. A mated omega is assessed in the presence of her mate. The individual wellness check becomes a joint appointment. The healer's attention goes to the pair, to the bond, to its health, to its stability." He paused. "Not to the individual's shift status." She bit into the apple. She chewed. She looked at the table surface between them. "That is accurate," she said. "That is how mated assessments work." "Yes," he said. "And you are telling me this because—" "I am offering to be your mate," he said. Exactly as simple as that. Not a performance of simplicity. Just the fact of the thing laid out on the table between them the way you laid out a map when you needed to discuss a route. She took another bite. He watched her eat the apple with the same level attention he watched everything else. Fletcher, she said. Maron, he said. This is a significant thing to offer someone. Yes, he said. It is not temporary, she said. A mated claim is not something you walk back after the review. The pack knows, the king knows, the records show it. It changes every aspect of your standing in this pack, your freedom of movement, your future choices. I know what it changes, he said. Then you know it is not a solution to a problem, she said. It is an entirely different set of consequences. Yes, he said. She finished one side of the apple and turned it and bit into the other side. She was aware that she was eating the apple in a way that had become slightly mechanical, not tasting it, just occupying her hands with it, and she kept doing it anyway because her hands needed to be occupied. Tell me what you think this solves, she said. Walk me through it. The wellness assessment becomes a joint appointment, he said. The healer assesses the bond and its health. A new bond is expected to be imperfect. The health of a new bond is measured differently than an established one. Your individual status becomes secondary to the fact of the mating. And the main presentation. You stand with me, presented as my mate. The king's attention goes to the alpha and the beta and the senior pack members first. By the time it reaches a beta's mate, the assessment has already been formed. She looked at him. He looked back at her. You have thought about this carefully, she said. Yes, he said. For how long? Since the first time I crossed your name out of the logbook, he said. She sat with this, she turned it over. She thought about 8 months of checkmarks, and a man who had been building a shelter without being asked to, without being thanked for it, without even being acknowledged, and had kept building it anyway. The apple was almost gone. She was about to eat the core, which she sometimes did when she had forgotten she was eating because she was thinking about something else. She noticed this before she bit into it, which was something. Fletcher, she said. You're going to say no, he said. He said it without bitterness. He said it the way you stated an expected outcome when you had already run the calculation. I'm going to say no, she agreed. But I need you to hear why, because it matters that you hear the right reason. He waited. You would be walking into a fire for someone who might simply be what she appears to be, she said. An omega who cannot shift, not blocked, not delayed, not going to suddenly become what the pack needs her to be in time for the review or after it or ever. If that is what I am, if that is just what I am, then I would have chained you to me for the rest of both our lives to solve a problem that was mine and not yours. He looked at her for a long moment. I know exactly what you are, he said. No, she said, you don't, I don't, nobody does, that's the point. I know you well enough, he said. You know the version of me that shows up every day and does her job and manages everything carefully and does not need anything from anyone, she said. That is a real version. But it is not the only one, and the version you would be bound to, the actual full version, whatever that is, you have not met her. Neither have I. He was quiet. It's a generous offer, she said. It is the most generous thing anyone has ever offered me, and I want you to know that I understand what it cost you to say it out loud. It didn't cost me anything, he said. Fletcher. He looked at the table. A small muscle at the corner of his jaw tightened once and then released. It's the right thing to do, he said. That's all. You are in a situation that is not your fault and it has a solution and I can provide the solution. That's the entirety of it. She looked at him for a long time. She looked at him with the careful attention she had been trained by years of necessity to pay to people, the attention that found things below the surface, and she found, below the logical clean description of it being the right thing to do, the other thing that he was not going to say. She was not going to make him say it. I need 6 more days, she said. I need to try something. If it doesn't work, I will think about what you've offered, genuinely. You won't think about it, he said. You'll decide it's too much to ask of me, and you'll decide that on my behalf without asking me, and you'll walk into that presentation alone, and whatever happens will happen, and you will have made that decision for both of us. She opened her mouth and closed it. Because he was not wrong. He knew her well enough to have named exactly what she would do. She had been about to do it. She could feel the shape of the decision forming, the exact logic of it. Too much to ask, not his problem to solve. She had managed alone for this long. She would manage alone for the next 6 days and whatever came after. Maybe, she said. I'm not asking you to accept, he said. I'm asking you not to decide for me. She looked at the apple core in her hand. She set it on the table. All right, she said. I won't decide for you. That's what I can give you right now. The offer stays on the table and I won't fold it up and put it away without telling you. He nodded. He looked at the apple core on the table between them. That's the whole thing, he said. Core and all. She looked at it too. I wasn't paying attention, she said. He made a sound. It was a small sound, somewhere in the vicinity of a laugh, but it had something else in it. Something that she did not look at too directly, because looking at it directly was not something she was ready to do today, with 6 days left, and the Alpha King's name sitting in her chest like something with weight. He stood up. I'll see you at the afternoon briefing, he said. I'll be there, she said. He left. She sat at the kitchen table after the door closed and looked at the apple core and the empty place where he had been sitting and the morning light on the table's surface, and she thought about chains and fires and the version of herself she had not met yet. She thought about whether refusing help was the same thing as being strong. She thought about the distinction between those two things, which she had not previously considered as a distinction at all. She got up and threw the apple core away. She washed her hands at the sink. She looked out the window at the morning. There were 6 days left. She was going to try something. She had been trying the wrong things for 24 years. She had been trying quietly, trying alone, trying with the part of herself that was always careful, always controlled, always making sure that what she did was small enough to go unnoticed. Maybe that was the problem. Maybe the shift required something the size of a real thing, not a managed thing, not a thing she could put in a box. Something that was the actual size of what she was. She did not know how to make something that large. She had been making small things for so long that she was not sure she had the equipment for it anymore. But she was going to try. 6 days. She went to work. The afternoon briefing was in the community hall, and it was packed. Every PAC member who could attend was there, because every PAC briefing in the last week had drawn a full crowd, because collective anxiety had a particular gravity to it, and people moved toward each other when they felt it. Garrett ran the briefing efficiently. He went over the review schedule in detail. He assigned preparation tasks. He covered what the King's party would need in terms of accommodation and hospitality, which fell partly to the supply office, and therefore partly to Marin, who wrote down the relevant figures and made note of 2 logistics questions she would need to resolve before the end of the week. She was good at logistics. She could prepare an Alpha King's visit with the same efficiency she applied to grain delivery, and she would do exactly that, because the alternative, standing in the middle of this briefing and feeling the full weight of what was coming, was not something she was doing in a room full of people. She sat in the 4th row beside Harold, who sighed once during the accommodation discussion, and she wrote her notes and listened to the briefing and looked like exactly what she was. A steady, reliable woman who had everything under control. At the back of the room she saw Owen Greer leaning against the wall, his arms folded, his eyes passing over the room. When they passed over her, they paused for half a second, in the way they had in the market square, and then continued on. She would take that half second. She would take every version of quiet support that was being offered to her, because she had spent too long refusing things on the grounds that needing them made her vulnerable, and she was running low on time to keep doing that. On the way out, Orna touched her arm. Not the wrist, the arm higher up, just a brief press of the walking stick hand before it was withdrawn. Marin looked at her. Orna said nothing. She just looked in Marin's direction with those near-blind eyes, and the expression on her face was the one Marin had been trying to categorize since the assembly hall, the one that was not pity, not grief, not exactly. She understood it now. It was the expression of someone who had watched something for a very long time and was watching, with the particular patience of a person who could wait as long as necessary to see how it ended. Marin nodded at her. Orna nodded back. Marin went home through the birch trees. 6 days. She had a wooden stamp in her jacket pocket, and a man's offer sitting on her kitchen table, and the name Corin Aldrich in her chest like something she had swallowed without meaning to. She was going to find out what she was made of. In 6 days, she was going to find out what she had always been and never had the right conditions to become. Or she was going to stand in a field and hold very still and wait for whatever came next. She had been standing and holding still for 24 years. She was tired of waiting for the right conditions. Maybe the right conditions were the worst ones. Maybe that was the point. The night before the Alpha King arrived, Maren went to the forest. She had gone every night for the past 5 nights. This was not new behavior. She had gone to the forest at night alone for years, for the obvious reasons and the less obvious ones. The obvious reason was the border trail and the stamp and the careful maintenance of a fiction. The less obvious reason was that the forest at night was the only place she had ever felt like she was allowed to be whatever she actually was, rather than the managed, reliable, controlled version of herself that the settlement required. In the forest, there was nobody watching. In the forest, the performance was suspended and she could just be, whatever that was, however incomplete or wrong-shaped or hollow it felt. She had gone every night this week without the stamp. She had left it on her kitchen table beside the apple core she kept not throwing away. She had thrown away the core, but the stamp was still there, removed from her pocket on the evening of Fletcher's visit and not replaced. She had looked at it each morning when she made coffee and each evening when she came home, and she had not picked it up. She had gone to the forest without it, and she had stood in clearings and among trees, and in the particular darkness under the canopy where the moon did not reach, and she had tried to shift. She had not shifted. She had not shifted on night 1. She had not shifted on night 2, when she had stayed out until 3 in the morning and come home with wet feet from standing in a stream because she had read years ago that cold water sometimes activated a shift response, and she had been reduced clearly to the kinds of things you read years ago and were desperate enough to try. She had not shifted on night 3 or 4 or 5. She had stood in various locations in the forest, and she had tried with the quiet trying she had always done, the careful interior reaching toward the thing that was not there, and she had felt nothing except the cold and the darkness and the sounds of the night forest, which were beautiful if you were capable of attending to them, which she sometimes was not. Tonight was different only in the sense that it was the last night. Tomorrow the Alpha King would arrive. Tomorrow the review would begin. The morning after that, the 3rd day, she would stand in the assembly field with the whole pack, and she would find out what happened to a woman who had been faking wolf tracks when the person standing across from her had been trained professionally to find exactly that. She had not accepted Fletcher's offer. She was not going to accept Fletcher's offer. She had said she would not decide for him, and she had meant it, and she had been honest with herself every day about the shape of the decision she was still carrying. She carried it the way you carried something you were not going to use but could not put down. She understood its weight. She appreciated what it meant that it had been offered. But she could not build a life on it. Not because of him, because of her. Because she had a particular relationship with the truth of what she was that required her to meet it on her own terms before she involved anyone else in it. She could not stand in a review and present herself as someone's mate when she did not know who she was standing there as. She needed to know what she was before she could offer it to anyone. She understood that this was possibly the stubbornness of a person who had managed alone for so long that she had mistaken it for a value. She understood this. She was going to be stubborn about it anyway. The forest tonight was very quiet. The kind of quiet that felt attentive, if you were the kind of person who felt those things. She was not sure she was. She had always been more literal than mystical, more practical than given to the belief that the natural world had opinions about her personal situation. But the forest tonight had that particular quality of held breath that she associated with things that were about to change. Or things that were not about to change, and the held breath was her own, projected outward, because she needed something outside herself to give it back to her. She walked to the clearing she liked best. It was not dramatic. It was just a gap in the trees where the canopy opened enough for moonlight to come through, where the ground was soft and the grass grew in patches between the roots. She had been coming here for years. She knew the specific stone at the eastern edge, flat and wide enough to sit on, and she went to it and sat down and put her hands on her knees and looked up at the moon. The moon was 3/4 full. Wolves and moons, she knew the lore, and she had tried the lore, and the lore had not produced anything. Full moons had passed over her for 24 years and produced no shift and no revelation. She was not a story moon person. Whatever she was apparently a daytime person, or a rain person, or a nobody knows what kind of person, and she had mostly stopped believing the moon had anything particular to say to her. But it was pretty. She looked at it for a while. Then she stood up. She stood in the center of the clearing, and she closed her eyes. She had done this before, many times. She knew the interior landscape of this attempt, the deliberate slow breathing, the letting go of the surface noise of thought, the reaching down toward the place where she imagined the wolf lived if it lived anywhere. She had a very clear mental image of this place, built from years of trying to access it. It was like a room at the bottom of a long staircase. She could see the door. She had never been able to get the door open. Tonight she stood in the clearing, and she closed her eyes, and she went through the familiar preparation. She breathed. She let the surface noise go, the review, the king's name, Fletcher's offer, the stamp on her kitchen table, the folded letter in the drawer. She went down to the door. It was still closed. She stood there for a long time. The frogs were extremely loud tonight. She had not noticed them before, or she had noticed them but they had been background, the way all sound was background when you were trying to do something that required interior attention. But now, in the particular quality of attention that came after you had been trying for a long time and had stopped expecting results, they were simply there, loud and confident and completely unconcerned with what she was trying to do. The frogs did not know they were not supposed to be the thing she was paying attention to. She paid attention to them for a moment. Then she heard the owl. It was in the tree at the western edge of the clearing, the tall oak with the wide second branch that it apparently found acceptable for sitting purposes. She could not see it in the dark. She could hear it, the particular round sound of a tawny owl, in the way that sound filled the air with a kind of satisfaction. She opened her eyes. She could not see the owl, but she could see the branch, and she could see the shape of night sky that an owl-shaped bird made against the sky, and she looked at it for a moment. "I've been out here 6 nights, she said, out loud to the owl. The owl said its sound again. "I know," she said, "I noticed the pattern too." She sat back down on the stone. She put her hands on her knees. She looked up at the moon through the gap in the trees, and she thought about what Orna had said about the woman who held her breath for 27 years. And she thought about what she had said to herself in the days after, about the box, about the lid, about the anger that needed to stop being managed. She had been thinking about anger. She was not naturally an angry person. She had anger, she would not pretend she did not, but it was the kind of anger that lived in a controlled place, that came out in specific calibrated amounts when specific things required it, and then went back in. She did not rage. She did not have the kind of burning, sustained fury that made people do reckless things. Her anger was more like a precision tool she picked up and put back down. She had been thinking about what it would feel like to not put it back down. To just let it stay out. To let it be the actual size of what it was, instead of the size she had trimmed it to. She tried this now, sitting on the stone in the clearing, with the frogs and the owl and the 3/4 moon. She thought about what her life had been. Not the narrative version she kept in her head, which was practical and forward-facing and focused on what was currently necessary. The honest version. The version that started at 6 years old in a healer's office, and included the look on the healer's face the 3rd time she confirmed what was wrong, which was a look that contained something Maren had understood even then, something that said this child will be a problem we manage rather than a person we see. She thought about that. She let herself feel it instead of filing it. She thought about the house at the edge of the settlement, the house designed to be inside the border while being outside the center, the physical expression of a status that nobody had said out loud but everyone understood. She felt that too. She thought about the stamp, about the specific weight of the decision, at 15, after Peter had been sent away, to carve something out of wood that said she existed in a way that she did not actually exist, because existence was preferable to absence even when the existence was made of oak and careful mud. She felt that. She let it accumulate. She had not done this before. She had let herself feel things and then organized them and filed them before they got large enough to require anything of her. She had become very skilled at the organizational step. She could go from feeling something to having it filed in a fraction of the time most people took, which meant the feeling was only briefly in the open before it was somewhere safe. Tonight she did not file it. She left it out. She let it sit in the clearing with her and the frogs and the owl and the moon, and she felt how large it was. How long 24 years of that organizational reflex was, piled up, when you did not disperse it in small regular amounts but let it be all at once. It was very large. It filled the clearing, or felt like it did, and it was louder than the frogs, or felt like it was, and it did not have a shape she could describe, but it was definitely there, present in her chest and her hands and the back of her throat in a way that was uncomfortable and also familiar in the deepest possible way, the way that things you have always known but never acknowledged were familiar. She sat with it. She did not shift. She had not been sure she would. She had not come out here tonight with the expectation that this time would be different. She had come because it was the last night before the last chance, and she owed herself the attempt. But she sat with the feeling and she let it be the size of what it was, and at some point she realized she was crying, and she had no idea when she had started. Her face was wet and the moon was blurry and the frogs were still going at full volume. She wiped her face with her sleeve. The owl shifted on its branch. She heard the movement, feathers, and the creak of the wood. Then it left. She heard the brief beat of wings, and then the silence of something that had been there and was now not. Just like that. She sat in the empty clearing for a while. Then she went home. She went home and she washed her face at the kitchen sink, and she looked at her reflection in the dark window. Red eyes, damp cheeks, the same jaw that always set itself the same way when she was managing something. She looked at the wooden stamp on the kitchen table. She had not picked it up all week. She picked it up now. She turned it over in her hands, feeling the carved shape of it, the smooth oak that had been worn smooth by years of pocket carrying. She knew every edge of it. She had spent more time with this object than with almost anything else she owned. She set it back down on the table. She was not going to bring it tomorrow. She had known this for several days and had not said it to herself directly until now. The stamp was not coming with her. Whatever happened at the review, whatever the Alpha King found when he looked at her, she was not going to bring the oak stamp to a meeting that was already about what she was hiding. There was a line she was not crossing. The line was this: she would stand in that field and she would not pretend. She had no idea what would happen after that. But she had been making tracks that were not hers for 3 years, and she was done with that. Whatever she had to face, the removal, the relocation, the quiet, uncomfortable separation that everyone agreed was for the best, she would face it as what she actually was. An omega without a shift. A woman who had managed alone for 24 years. A person who had been keeping the lid on a very large box and who had opened it tonight, in a clearing with frogs and an owl, and found out that the contents were exactly as big as she had always suspected and exactly as survivable. She was tired. She went to bed. She lay in the dark and she did not think about tomorrow. She thought about the owl leaving. How it went from there to not there without announcement or explanation. Just the beat of wings and then air where something had been. She thought about what it felt like to leave a space. Whether the space knew the difference. She fell asleep before she had an answer. The Alpha King arrived with the morning. Not with the pre-morning gray that Maren was used to, the quiet uncertainty of early light, but with the actual morning, the decisive kind, when the sun has committed to rising and the day is no longer offering alternatives. His party came through the north gate at 8:03, and Maren was in the supply office at that moment, confirming the last of the accommodation arrangements and counting a delivery of firewood that had arrived an hour early and therefore required immediate logging. She heard the horns. They were brief and not dramatic, 2 notes, a formal acknowledgement, the traditional signal that a visiting alpha had crossed into a host pack's territory. She had heard it a handful of times in her life when other pack's senior members came through. It was a courteous sound, a sound that said, "We are here, we come with intention, we observe the forms." She logged the firewood. She finished the accommodation confirmation. She put on her jacket. There was a window in the supply office that looked out over the main settlement path, and she went to it and stood slightly to the side of it, not hiding, just not announcing herself, and she watched the arrival party move through the settlement toward the main hall where Garrett would receive them formally. There were 10 riders. 4 were what she took for senior scouts, compact and observant, their attention moving constantly across the settlement as they rode through it. 2 were what looked like administrative members. They carried document cases and had the look of people whose job was to process whatever information the scouts gathered. 2 more were large enough and alert enough to be security of some kind. 1 was a healer, a woman Maren pegged immediately by her posture, the particular stillness of medical attention, the way her eyes moved across the gathered crowd with the calm, assessing quality of someone measuring rather than watching. And the one at the front. He was not the most visually distinct member of the party. She noted this because it surprised her. She had built an image of the Alpha King in her head over the past 11 days based on the weight of his name and the texture of his reputation, and the image had included the kind of physical presence that announced itself before the person arrived, the kind of man who made space rearrange itself. He did not look like that. He looked like a man on a horse. He was tall, she could see that even mounted, with the broad build of someone who moved heavy things and covered large distances. His hair was dark and cut short. His face was, she could not see it clearly yet, not at this distance and angle. He wore the riding clothes of a working traveler, not formal clothes, not the kind of thing designed to signal status. He wore the kind of clothes that said the rank is not in the fabric. He turned his head and looked at the settlement as he rode through it, the way someone looked at a place they were genuinely trying to understand rather than a place they were assessing for its submission. She stepped back from the window. The next 2 days were logistics. She had expected this. A territorial review was a complicated undertaking and required enormous coordination on the host pack's side. She had prepared for this. She had lists and schedules and contingency plans, and she worked through them with her usual efficiency, which was perhaps slightly more efficient than usual, because efficiency was the only place she had full confidence in herself right now, and she was going to use it as long as it was available. The healer met with pack members in pairs through the first day. Individual wellness assessments, 2 people at a time, conducted in the small meeting room attached to the main hall. She heard from Celia that it was not intrusive, that the healer, whose name was Dr. Wren, was professional and thorough, and had a particular way of asking questions that made people feel as though they had been heard rather than processed. Maren's appointment was the morning of the second day. She arrived at the correct time. She sat in the outer waiting area for 7 minutes. She was shown into the room. Dr. Wren was small and gray-haired, and had the air of someone who had been doing this work long enough to have very little left to surprise her. She gestured toward the chair across the table from her, and Maren sat in it. Maren Voss, Dr. Wren said, supply coordinator. Yes, Maren said. How long have you been with this pack? My whole life, Maren said, 24 years. Dr. Wren wrote something. Then she set down her pen and looked at Maren. The looking had the quality Maren had been expecting, calm, precise, the kind of attention that was not performing interest but actually had it. Tell me about your general health, Dr. Wren said. Maren told her about her general health, which was good. She did not get sick often. She had no chronic conditions. She slept in the normal range, ate well, spent time outdoors. She answered each question in the straightforward way she answered everything, and she watched Dr. Wren's face as she answered, and she saw at some point, she could not have said exactly when, the quality of the healer's attention change. Not dramatically, a slight adjustment, the way a person's attention adjusted when they found what they were looking for. Dr. Wren did not say anything about what she had found. She finished the session professionally, thanked Maren for her time, made her notes. She was courteous and careful, and completely unreadable, in the way that people who had spent years receiving difficult information had learned to be. Maren walked out of the assessment room into the corridor of the main hall and stood there for a moment. Dr. Wren knew. She had known within the first 5 minutes, probably sooner. The rest of the appointment had been professional thoroughness, the completion of a task that had already yielded its most significant finding. The question was what she would do with it. Maren walked back to the supply office. She worked through the afternoon. She did not allow herself to think about the main presentation on the 3rd day, which was tomorrow, because thinking about it was not going to change it, and the alternative was just continued logistics work, which was what she had. At some point in the late afternoon, she looked up from her ledger and found that the quality of light outside the window had changed in the way it changed when something had moved between her and the sun. She turned to look. The Alpha King was standing outside the supply office window. He was not standing there looking at her specifically. He was standing in the general area outside the supply buildings, speaking with two of his scouts, and his attention was on them. He had a notebook in his hand, and one of the scouts was pointing at something further down the settlement path, and they were having what looked like a working conversation about whatever the scout was pointing at. She turned back to her ledger. She went back to work. She was halfway through a column of figures when she became aware, with the particular awareness that came from years of monitoring her environment for safety, that the quality of light outside the window had changed again. The scouts were gone. The Alpha King was looking at the window. Not at the supply office in general, at the window at her. She kept her eyes on the ledger. He was looking at her for a reason, she knew this. She knew it the way she knew many things, through a combination of observation and the kind of educated inference that you built after years of needing to understand what people were going to do before they did it. Dr. Wren had filed her report. Of course she had, that was her job. And the king was, by his nature and by his reputation, the kind of man who read his reports and then went to see for himself. She turned the page of the ledger. She added a column of numbers. After approximately 2 minutes, the quality of light outside the window changed back to normal. She did not look up. She sat in the supply office until an hour after closing time, which was not unusual for her, and then she locked up and put on her jacket and walked home. He had looked at her. She had been looked at before, many times in many ways. She had been looked at by healers checking for what was wrong and pack members trying to understand what she was, and border patrol wolves noting her presence in places she was not expected to be. This had been different. It had been the difference between someone looking to find something and someone looking to understand something. It was the same distinction Fletcher had made between the two things that felt identical from a distance, but produced completely different experiences up close. She put her key in her front door. She went in. She stood in her kitchen for a moment, and she looked at the wooden stamp on the table, and then she picked it up and put it in the kitchen drawer beside the folded letter and the spare keys. She closed the drawer. The next morning was the main presentation. She arrived at the assembly field at the correct time, not early, not late, because early would draw the wrong kind of attention and late would draw any attention at all, and she was managing this carefully, which she understood was possibly the last thing she would ever manage carefully. The field was full. Every member of the pack was there, which was several hundred people arranged in concentric semicircles around the central space where Garrett and the Alpha King's party would stand. She found a position in the 4th row, which was where she sat in assemblies, which felt correct, which was possibly just habit. Harold was to her left. To her right was a man she did not know well, Cobb, one of the Border Patrol regulars, quiet and tall, who smelled like pine resin and damp earth, which was just what he always smelled like. The sun was clear and sharp. Garrett and the Alpha King came out of the main hall together and took their positions in the central space. She saw him properly for the first time. He was taller than she had estimated from the window and the arrival, which she noted and adjusted for. His face was the kind of face that had done things, not a decorative face, a working one, planes and angles, not soft, dark eyes that moved through the assembled crowd with the same steady attention she had seen in the window, the same quality of looking to understand rather than looking to find. He moved with Garrett through the formal presentation, which proceeded the way formal things proceeded, slowly, with acknowledgement and ceremony, the traditional exchange of recognition between a visiting Alpha and a host pack's leader. Then Garrett addressed the pack, and the king stood beside him and listened. Then it was the king's turn to speak. He did not speak at length. He said what the review was for, not as a speech but as an explanation. He said it in plain language without the formality that Garrett used, and she could hear in the plainness of it the quality Fletcher had described. A man who had already assumed that everyone in front of him was capable of hearing a direct thing and had decided to trust that assumption. He moved through the front rows. She watched him do it. He moved slowly, stopping to speak with individuals, spending more time with some than others. He was not interrogating, he was not ceremonial, He was doing what he had described, understanding the pack, looking at it with his full attention, person by person, without rushing. She watched him come through the second row. Harold sighed. Cobb shifted his weight. She put her hands in front of her and stood with her usual stillness and looked at a point approximately 12 feet ahead, which was the posture of someone waiting calmly for something that was coming. The king came to the third row. He stopped at the third row, slightly to the left of center. He spoke with a woman there, a senior member, 20 years in the pack, someone whose presence was solid and established. She saw the woman's face change when he spoke to her. Not fear, something else. The particular response of someone who has been seen accurately and is deciding what to do about it. He moved along the third row. He came to the fourth. He stepped into the fourth row, not walking along its front edge, but actually stepping into the space between the third and fourth rows, which changed the geometry of the attention. Instead of the sweep of a person passing, it became the weight of someone present. He walked along the fourth row. He stopped. He did not stop at Harold. He did not stop at Cobb. He stopped in front of Maren. He stopped and then he backed up 3 steps. She had not expected this, the backing up. It was not aggressive. It was more like a recalibration. A person who had walked past something and then registered what they had passed and returned to it. He was not looking at her face. He was looking at the space around her, the air beside her shoulders, the ground below her feet, the general presence of her in the way that a wolf sensed the presence of another wolf. She had seen this before. She knew exactly what he was doing because she had seen it done to pack members who were ill once, and to a very old wolf in the final year before he died, when his energy had thinned to something that the other wolves could feel. He was looking at the hollow space where her wolf should be. She looked at Cobb's left ear. It was a perfectly ordinary ear. Maren had never before considered Cobb's ear specifically. It had a small scar on the upper edge which she had not previously noticed. She studied this with disproportionate interest because the alternative was looking at the Alpha King, and she was not doing that yet. The silence stretched. Not a long silence, probably 7 seconds, maybe 10, but the particular quality of a silence that has a shape to it, a direction, like water finding a way downhill. She felt his gaze move from the space around her to her face. She moved her own gaze from Cobb's ear. She looked at him. He was looking at her. Not with the look she had prepared for, not the trained official look of a leader identifying a problem, not the clinical look of someone categorizing what they found. He was looking at her with the same quality she had noticed from the window, the understanding kind. Her chin stayed level. Her hands stayed still. Her face was doing what it always did when she was managing something very large in a very small space. Nothing, completely nothing, the stillness that she had spent 24 years perfecting. The frogs were not here to be loud for her. The owl was not here to leave. It was just her and the stillness she had made of herself, standing in a field in the sharp morning sun, meeting the eyes of the Alpha King of the most powerful pack in the region. He did not say anything. She did not say anything. Harold sighed. She thought she saw something move in the king's eyes when Harold sighed, not amusement exactly, but something in the neighborhood of it, and then it was gone, and he was still looking at her. Then he moved on. He walked the rest of the fourth row. He moved to the fifth. He continued through the assembled pack with the same steady attention, the same plain presence, the same quality of a man doing the thing he had come to do. She let out a breath so carefully that it would not have been audible to Harold, to Cobb, to anyone without ears significantly better than human ones. But she let it out. The rest of the presentation passed. Garrett gave the formal close. The Alpha King's party withdrew toward the main hall. The pack dispersed in the usual way, in small clusters of conversation and movement. She walked toward the edge of the field. She was almost to the tree line when she heard her name. She turned. Owen was behind her. He was not running. He was walking quickly but with deliberate control. He stopped when she turned and he looked at her with the particular expression she had come to associate with him over the past weeks, something measured and direct. "He's going to want to speak with you separately," Owen said. "Fletcher has already been told. The meeting is this afternoon." She nodded. She had expected this. She went to the tree line and stood among the first of the trees for a moment, looking back at the empty field. The formal part was over. The real part was about to begin. Fletcher came to her at noon. She was at her desk in the supply office, not working. The ledger was open in front of her because having the ledger open was what she did at her desk, and she had apparently kept the habit on the last afternoon of her previous life, but she was not working. She was sitting with her hands flat on the desk surface, and she was looking at the window, and she was thinking about whether the next few hours would produce something she could survive. She believed they would. She was not entirely sure. Fletcher closed the door behind him. He came to the other side of the desk. He did not sit down. 2 o'clock, he said, in the garden room at the back of the main hall. She knew the garden room. It was a meeting space, small, plain, with large windows that looked out over the back gardens and the tree line beyond. It was used for the kind of conversations that needed quiet without formality. It was not the official meeting room. It was not the Alpha's office. Not official, she said. He asked for an unofficial space, Fletcher said. He asked specifically for somewhere that felt outside the hierarchy. She thought about what that meant. A man who could have called for an official summoning, a formal meeting, the documented weight of an Alpha King requesting an account from a pack member, and had instead asked for a garden room. "Will you be there?" she said. "I was invited," Fletcher said. Garrett was not. The distinction was deliberate. She understood the distinction. An Alpha King and a Beta and one pack member in a garden room outside the hierarchy. The Beta's presence offered her some nominal protection, a witness, a familiar person. Garrett's absence meant the meeting was not, at this moment, an official pack matter. "All right," she said. Fletcher stayed on the other side of her desk for a moment. He was looking at her with that level attention. "Whatever happens in that room," he said, "I need you to know something before you go in." "Fletcher, it will take 8 seconds," he said. She waited. "You have done something extraordinary," he said. "Not the tracks, the rest of it. 24 years of being exactly what this pack needed you to be, without anyone giving you permission to need anything back. I want you to walk into that room knowing that someone has seen that, not the problem of it, the actual achievement of it." She looked at him. Her face was doing the nothing thing. But something behind it was doing something else, and he could apparently see this because he nodded once briefly and then stepped back. 2 o'clock, he said. "I'll be there," she said. He left. She sat with her hands flat on the desk for a while after that. She had a specific feeling she could not name exactly. Not gratitude, not quite. Something older than gratitude. The feeling of being seen by someone who was not looking to find a problem. The feeling that had no clean English word for it, that she had only ever felt in passing before, and which was, today, loud enough to require attention. She put it in the back of her mind, not in the box, just back. She would feel it fully later when she had time for full things. She spent the next 2 hours working. She worked through the fuel delivery discrepancy she had been tracking for the past week and found its source, a transposition error in the third entry that had cascaded through 4 subsequent calculations. She corrected it. The numbers resolved into sense, the way numbers always did when you found the original error and traced it forward. She filed the correction. She put on her jacket. At 5 minutes to 2, she walked to the main hall. The garden room was at the back, through a short corridor, past the storage closets that smelled of older wood and dust. The door was plain, unvarnished, with a brass handle that had been polished sometime in the recent past because it was bright where the rest of the hardware in the building was dull. She stopped outside it. She could hear faintly through the door, voices. One she recognized as Fletcher's, one she did not recognize but was low enough that the room temperature seemed to drop slightly when she heard it through the wood. She opened the door. Fletcher was standing to the right of the entrance, which meant she saw him first, and she appreciated this because it gave her something familiar to settle on before she turned her attention to the rest of the room. The room was as she remembered it, plain, sunlit, the large windows opened slightly to the smell of the back gardens. A table with 4 chairs around it, though only 2 were occupied. There were papers on the table in front of the occupied chairs, though the papers were face down. The Alpha King was sitting in the chair closest to the windows. He was not sitting in the formal way of someone holding authority in a room. He was sitting the way a person sat when they had been doing something all day and were taking a moment to think. One arm on the table, turned slightly toward the window, and he was looking at the gardens when she entered. He turned at the sound of the door. He stood up. She had not expected him to stand. Authority generally did not stand when the person entering the room was not equivalent authority. She registered this and added it to the picture she was building of him in real time, which was very different from the picture she had built over the past 11 days. "Maren Vos," he said. "Yes," she said. He gestured toward the chair across from his. She came to the table and sat in it. Fletcher remained standing near the door. The king sat back down. Up close, his face was different from what she had seen in the field. Not in its basic structure, the planes and angles were the same, the working quality of it. But at this distance the eyes were clearer, and they were doing the thing she had seen from across the field, the understanding quality, except at this distance it was much more present and therefore considerably more difficult to manage. She managed it anyway. She put her hands on the table. She waited. He looked at her for a moment. He did not seem to find the silence uncomfortable, which was consistent with what Fletcher had described. He picked up a pen and set it down again, not a fidget, just a movement, the gesture of someone whose hands thought independently of the rest of them. "I want to ask you something," he said, "before we go through anything official." "All right," she said. "The border trail," he said. "East section, markers 9 to 11. Has anyone else been maintaining it for you, or have you done it yourself?" She had been expecting this. She had prepared for it. She had decided in the clearing with the frogs and the owl that she was not going to pretend, and that decision extended to this room. "Myself," she said. "Every week for the last 3 years, twice a week on average." He nodded. He was looking at her steadily. "Carved stamp," she said. "Oak. I calibrated it to the correct size for a female wolf, my body weight, and built the stride length from observation." Fletcher did not make any sound. She did not look at him. "You studied existing tracks," the king said. "Yes, I kept a notebook." "Do you still have it?" "Yes." He looked at her for a moment. "That level of preparation," he said, "for a deception you maintained alone for 3 years, that is not the work of someone afraid of being caught. That is the work of someone who had decided not to be caught." "Yes," she said. "What was the alternative?" She understood he was asking what she had been avoiding, what the catch would have meant. "Removal," she said. "Relocation to a sanctuary community. I watched it happen to someone else when I was 16. I decided I was not going to let it happen to me." "And so you built a version of yourself that could stay." She looked at the table for a moment. Not as an avoidance, she just needed a second to receive the phrasing of that. "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment. He turned the pen over in his fingers once. "How long since you last tried to shift?" he said. "Last night," she said. He looked up. "I have been trying every night this week," she said. "Before that, at irregular intervals for the past 18 years. The first attempt I remember making consciously was when I was 6. I have a very clear memory of it because I had been told what was expected, and I tried to do it and nothing happened, and I was old enough by then to understand that the nothing was the problem." 6 is early to understand something like that," he said. "I was a practical child," she said. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile exactly, the suggestion of one, a direction the expression was traveling before it stopped. "And last night," he said, "nothing." "Nothing," she said. He was quiet. She was quiet. Outside the garden windows, a bird did something in one of the hedges. Fletcher had not moved from his position near the door. "I want to tell you something," the king said. She waited. "What my scouts reported from this territory," he said, "was not a pack with a deficiency. What they reported was a pack that was whole except for one place, one space. Like a room in a house where the furniture has been removed and the house is still a house, it functions completely as a house, but the room feels different when you walk into it. Not damaged, just waiting." She sat with this. "Waiting for what?" she said. He looked at her steadily. "That depends," he said, "on whether the room has forgotten what it's supposed to hold." She felt something move in her chest. She pressed it down, not into the box. She had decided about the box, but just back for a moment. "I have not forgotten," she said. "No," he said, "that's clear." What I see in you is not an Omega who cannot shift. What I see is an Omega who has been holding something with enormous force for an enormous amount of time, and the holding is what's in the way." She looked at him. She was aware that her hands had pressed flat against the table. She was aware that the pressure of them against the wood was the only thing she was doing with the sensation moving through her chest that she was not putting anywhere. "Dr. Wren's report said the same thing," he said, in different language but the same conclusion. "And what is the difference," she said very carefully, "between an Omega who cannot shift and one who has been holding something in the way for 24 years? "The outcome," he said. "Eventually. And if the holding never stops." He looked at her for a moment. He looked at her with the full weight of that attention, the understanding quality that had no softness in it, but also no hardness, just the clean directness of a person who had decided to be clear. "Then we have a conversation about what's best for you and for this pack," he said, "and I give you my word that conversation does not end with what happened to Peter." She went very still. He knew about Peter. Of course he knew about Peter. He reviewed territories. He had reviewed the territory that Peter had been sent to. He had the records. He had the picture. "Peter is well," the king said. "He chose to stay in the sanctuary community eventually because he found people there who understood him. But the original removal, that was a decision made in the absence of information that should have been present. I have been working for 5 years to change how that decision gets made." She breathed. She breathed very carefully. "The review," she said. "Is this why you added the individual assessments?" "Yes," he said. "You came here specifically for situations like mine." "I came here for the review," he said. "I came here for every member of this pack. You are not the only person in this territory who has been holding something in the way of what they are." He paused. "You are the most determined one." She sat with that. She looked at the window, at the garden beyond it, at the tree line at the far edge. The leaves were thinning into autumn, the same autumn as the leaves in the birch trees she walked through every morning. She turned back to him. "What would you have me do?" she said. "Practically, given what you know, what is the actual recommendation?" He looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood up. "Walk with me," he said. She looked at Fletcher. Fletcher gave her nothing, the level face, the brown eyes neutral. She stood up. The king walked toward the garden door at the back of the room, the one that led directly outside, to the back gardens and the tree line beyond, and he opened it and went through, and she followed him. The afternoon had that particular quality of late autumn afternoon where the light was clear but thin, and the shadows of the trees reached across the grass with precision. He walked with the easy, unhurried pace of someone covering ground without rushing it, and she walked beside him, and they were outside the room, outside the building, outside the visible structure of the review. He walked toward the tree line. She walked with him. The gardens were empty at this hour. The pack was still in the recovery of the morning's presentation, the particular social settling that followed formal events. Nobody was here, just the thin autumn light and the smell of the gardens and the approaching trees. He stopped at the edge of the grass, just where the first of the roots began. He turned. He looked at her. She looked at him. He was tall enough that she was looking up slightly, which she noted because she was someone who noted things like that, though she was not someone who was particularly bothered by them. He was looking at her with the direct, clear quality she had been receiving all afternoon, and his expression was the same as it had been in the garden room, not soft, not hard, just present. Then he leaned down. He was close enough that she could hear him clearly even though his voice was very low, not a whisper in the way of secrecy. But the way you spoke when what you were saying was meant for one person, and the distance between you made the volume irrelevant. He said something. She stopped walking. She had not been walking, but something in her that had been in motion since she was 6 years old, the managed, controlled, forward-moving engine of her stopped. She stood absolutely still. The afternoon sun was on the grass, and the leaves were falling in the slow way of autumn leaves, and Fletcher was somewhere behind them in the garden room, and she was standing at the edge of the forest with the Alpha King's words in her ear. She did not move. She did not speak. Something in her chest was doing something she could not describe and was not going to try to describe, not right now, not with her standing at the edge of the forest and the light being thin and clear, and the leaves coming down around them. She looked at the tree line. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked back at him. He had straightened and was watching her with the same steady attention he always had, and his expression was the same as it always was, and he was not adding anything to what he had said, not explaining it or elaborating on it, not doing what every other person who had ever said something significant to her had done, which was say it and then immediately start managing her reaction to it. He was just looking at her. She felt something large and old and very much alive move through her. She did not name it. She did not have to. What he had said was this: "You've been holding it back, not because you can't shift, because something in you decided a very long time ago that the pack wasn't worth showing yourself to. And you weren't wrong." She stood at the edge of the forest. A leaf came down between them slowly, the unhurried fall of something that had decided it was finished holding on. It landed on the grass and lay there. She looked at it. It was an ordinary autumn leaf, orange-brown at the edges, still green at its center in the specific middle stage of changing that was neither what it had been nor what it would become. She found this leaf extremely annoying, because she could feel what his words had done in her chest, and she was not ready for it, and the leaf was making it worse by existing in such a pointed way at exactly this moment. And she was standing at the edge of the forest with the Alpha King watching her with that level clear attention, and her face was doing the nothing thing because her face always did the nothing thing, but behind it something was happening that her face had no protocol for. He was not wrong about what he had said. That was the problem. She had been expecting something else. She had built very detailed internal preparations for several categories of things he might say to her in this meeting: the official version, the clinical version, the compassionate but firm version, and she had prepared for each of them with the same methodical thoroughness she applied to everything. She had prepared for being told she was a liability. She had prepared for being told there were options available to her. She had prepared for being told, kindly, that the situation required resolution. She had not prepared for being told that the pack wasn't worth showing herself to, because the pack not being worth it had been the unsayable thing. The thing she had known and organized around and never put words to, because putting words to it would have required admitting it, and admitting it would have required deciding what to do about it, and deciding what to do about it would have required her to either leave or to change her relationship with staying. She had not been able to leave. She had been born here. This was her territory in the deep ancestral sense that wolves understood territory, not a piece of land she had chosen but a place she was made of, the way you were made of your earliest years, the shape of the ground underfoot and the smell of the trees and the particular quality of light in this valley at every season she had ever lived through. She could not leave it. The leaving would have taken something she had needed to keep. So she had stayed. She had stayed and she had managed and she had built a version of herself that was always reliable, always present, always useful, and she had given that version to the pack every day for 24 years in the silent compact that said, "I will give you this, and you will let me stay." And the pack had let her stay. And something in her, below the compact and below the relief of the staying, had been furious about the terms. She had not known it was furious. She had known it was there, the low hum of it, the background noise of it, but she had organized it the same way she organized everything else, in the box with the lid in the managed space. She had not known how large it was until the clearing, until the night before the review, when she had opened the box and sat in the dark with it, and found out that it was the size of her entire life. He had said, "You weren't wrong." Nobody had ever said that to her. Not the healers who had been kind but had focused on the problem. Not Orna, who had been wise but had focused on the possibility. Not Fletcher, who had been generous in every form generosity took, but who had focused on the protection. Nobody had said, "You were right to withhold yourself from something that was not safe to give yourself to." Nobody had named the decision she had been making every day for 24 years as a decision at all. She was angry. She was surprised to find that she was angry. She had expected to feel she was not sure what she had expected. Relief, possibly. The particular exhaustion of being seen accurately after a long time of not being seen. Some complicated form of gratitude. But what was happening in her chest was anger, and it was not the managed kind, not the precision tool variety she kept calibrated for specific applications. It was the kind that felt sweet. That was the word, sweet, the way Orna's mother's cousin had found it familiar, like something she had been waiting for without knowing she was waiting for it. Her anger felt like finding the correct key to a lock she had been trying to open for years with the wrong keys. She was angry at the pack, for the ways it had organized itself around her absence in a way that was practical and convenient, and never asked what the absence cost. She was angry at herself for the 24 years of meticulous, exhausting performance. She was angry at the specific quality of the neat, clean logic that said a wolf who could not produce a visible shift was a liability, as if she had not been the most present and reliable member of this community for the entirety of her adult life. She was angry at the leaf. The leaf had nothing to do with anything, and she was angry at it anyway, which was possibly the first purely irrational thing she had allowed herself to feel in a very long time, and it was such a relief to feel something irrational that it almost made her laugh. She did not laugh. She felt something else instead. Something below the anger. Something the anger was clearing the way for, the way fast water cleared the surface of a stream before the deeper current became visible. She felt her wolf. Not a thought of her wolf, not an image of it or a memory of trying for it, or the familiar sensation of reaching toward the locked door at the bottom of the stairs. She felt the wolf itself, a presence actual and physical, the way you felt a person standing behind you before you turned to see them. A large, warm, real thing that had apparently been right there for the entirety of her life, and had simply been waiting for her anger to become large enough to clear the space. She heard herself make a sound. She could not have described the sound. It was not a word. It was the sound a person made when the thing they had been waiting for arrived without warning. The king did not move. He was watching her and he did not move. Her hands were different. She looked down at them and they were different. The structure of them, the feel of them, which was wrong and also completely correct, which was impossible and also obviously not impossible, which was. She shifted. She did not shift the way she had always imagined she would shift. She had imagined it would be deliberate. She had imagined, on the nights she had spent years trying for it, that the shift would be something she did, an act she initiated, like standing up or picking something up, a decision executed by her body at her instruction. It was not like that at all. It was more like something opening. Like a breath she had been holding for 24 years releasing all at once, and the body that had been holding the breath becoming, in the absence of the tension, the shape it had always been trying to be. She was on the ground. The grass was very close to her face, and it was cold in the particular way that grass was cold in autumn, and the smell of it was, she had no reference for the smell of it like this. She had always had a decent sense of smell, better than most people without the wolf, but this was not that. This was the world opening into a completely different depth, layer after layer of information. The soil below the grass and the roots below the soil and the old wood of the trees, and the afternoon air with its threads of smoke and cold, and rain coming somewhere far off, and she was furious. She was furious, and she was on the ground, and she was a wolf, and these three facts were occurring simultaneously, and she did not know what to do with any of them. She did the only thing that made sense. She looked at the king. He was looking at her. He had crouched down, which meant his face was closer to her level, and he was looking at her with the same expression he always had, steady, direct, the understanding quality, and there was something else in it now, something she had not seen there before. Not surprise. He had known, but the something else was real. She thought the word for it might be recognition. She held her ground. Literally, she felt the grass under her paws, which were her paws, which was a sentence she had not previously been able to form in her life, and she pressed them into the earth and she held there. She was angry. She was angry in the way she had been trying to be in the clearing for a week, and had never quite got to the full-size version, the version that did not file itself, the version that was the actual weight of what she had been carrying. She was angry that it had taken this, that it had taken 24 years, and a carved oak stamp, and a man leaning down and saying something plainly that nobody had ever been plain enough to say. She was angry in the specific direction of the Alpha King, who was crouched on the grass 3 feet away from her, and was looking at her with that expression. And she was angry at him in the particular way you were angry at someone who was right about something you were not ready for them to be right about. She held the anger. She let it be the size of what it was. She had opened the box in the clearing and she had found out what was inside it. And she had been right. It was the size of her entire life. And she was standing here now in the grass in the cold autumn afternoon with the full weight of it, and she was not putting it back. She was not going to put it back. Fletcher had come out of the garden room. She could feel him rather than see him, the familiar presence of him at the edge of the gardens, still, the way he always was. He had not moved toward them. She looked at the grass. She looked at the tree line. She looked back at the king. He had not said anything since the whisper. He had not moved except to crouch down. He was giving her the full room of this without filling it, without managing it, without doing the thing that every person who had ever found out something significant about her had done, which was immediately produce a plan. She did not know how long they stayed like that. Long enough for a bird to cross the tree line above her and vanish into the canopy. Long enough for the thin autumn light to shift a degree across the grass. Long enough for her breathing to slow from the urgent rhythm it had taken when she shifted into something steadier. And then she shifted back. That was also not what she had expected. She had expected it to be difficult. She had spent 24 years unable to get to the wolf. She had assumed that getting back from it would be complicated. But it was the same as the first direction, an opening and a release, the body moving between its two forms with the ease of something that had always known how to do it and had simply been waiting for permission. She was on her hands and knees on the grass. She sat back. She looked at her hands. Her ordinary hands, the ones that had carried the stamp that had signed the logbooks, that had pressed flat on every hard surface they had ever touched when she was trying to stay grounded. She looked at them for a long moment. The king straightened and stood. She got to her feet, slower than he had and not as smoothly, because her legs were doing something slightly uncertain, but she stood. He looked at her. She looked at him. "I am extremely angry with you," she said. Her voice sounded different to her own ears, not different in quality, the same voice. But it came from somewhere more central than it usually did, from a depth she did not usually open, and the words had the quality of things that were simply true rather than things she had decided to say. "I know," he said. "You said something designed to make me furious." "I said something that was true," he said. "The fury was yours." "That is a distinction without a practical difference." Something moved at the corner of his mouth again. This time it made it further than before. "No," he said, "it is the only distinction that matters." She put her hands in her pockets. She looked at the grass where she had been. There were marks there, marks in the grass that were not from her knees, that were paw-shaped, that were the actual prints of an actual wolf who was actually her. She looked at them for a moment. She looked back at him. "What happens now?" she said. "Now," he said, "we go back inside and I make a record that says this review found the pack in good health, all members present and accounted for." "All members," she said. "All members," he said. He was looking at her with the steady, direct attention. "You have been a member of this pack for 24 years. That is not a provisional status. That is the actual status." She absorbed this. She thought about Peter. "Peter," she said. "Should not have happened the way it did," the king said, "as I told you. That is a thing I am working to correct, across every territory." "Is that why you're really doing these reviews?" she said. "Not the territorial assessment, the individual assessments, the personal notices." He was quiet for a moment. "Partly," he said. She nodded. She understood partly. She understood that the work of correcting the wrong shape of a system was a long project and not a single review, and that he was one man with a territory and a court and the weight of several hundred packs in his authority, and that partly was honest and probably the most honest thing available to him. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. "All right," she said again. Fletcher was approaching from the garden room. He walked with his usual unhurried pace, his hands in his pockets, his face doing the level neutral thing. He stopped a few feet away and looked at her. She looked at him. She had nothing organized to say. This was unusual. She almost always had something organized to say. But the afternoon had used the part of her that organized things, and what was left was just the bare fact of being here and being this and having shifted twice in the space of 10 minutes, in front of two people she had been carrying secrets from for years. Well, Fletcher said. Yes, she said. He nodded. He looked at the grass where she had been, at the paw-shaped marks. Something in his face did something she had rarely seen it do, something brief and not performed and completely real, and then it was done and he was looking at her again. The briefing is at 5, he said. Supply office should have the King's party accommodation confirmed by 4:30. She looked at him. I will have it confirmed by 4, she said. He nodded. The King looked between them with the expression of a man who understood exactly what he was watching and had the courtesy not to comment on it. 4:30 is fine, the King said to her. Take the time. She looked at him. I don't need the time, she said. I need the work. He looked at her for a moment, the steady, clear attention. Yes, he said, I can see that. She pulled her jacket straight. She looked at the tree line one more time. She thought about the clearing and the frogs and the owl and 6 nights of standing in the dark reaching toward a door. The door had been on the wrong side. She had been standing outside it trying to open it from outside, and the whole time it had opened inward. She turned and walked back toward the supply office. The afternoon was thin and clear, and the leaves were still coming down, and the grass held her footprints and the other prints beside them, and she walked through the gardens and back into the building and sat down at her desk. She opened her ledger. She confirmed the accommodation figures. She had them done by 4. The forest that night was not the same forest. She went at the usual time, an hour after dark, when the settlement had settled into its evening routine, and the path to the tree line was empty, and the particular quality of night air arrived that she had been breathing for years as a form of maintenance. The usual route, the usual trees. It was not the same forest. She understood, standing at the edge of it, that the difference was not in the forest itself. The trees were the same. The ground was the same cold autumn ground, the leaves thicker on it now, the roots more present underfoot. The owl was probably in its oak. The frogs were probably still at their work. The difference was in what she was carrying when she walked into it. She had walked into this forest for years with the stamp in her pocket. The specific weight of it, not heavy, the oak was not thick, had been a constant. She had become so accustomed to the feel of it that its absence now was itself a presence. The way the space left by a piece of furniture was more noticeable than the furniture had been. The stamp was in her kitchen drawer. She was going to leave it there. She walked into the forest. She walked the border trail, the east section, markers 9 to 11, and she walked it without stopping, without crouching, without the careful measurements of stride and soil and pressure that had been her Tuesday ritual and her Thursday ritual for 3 years. She walked it the way a person walked a path they knew well and were simply passing through. She stopped at the end of the section, where the trail bent back toward the interior of the territory, and she stood in the dark for a moment. In the mud at her feet, there were the last set of prints she had made before she stopped. 10 days old now, softened by rain and compressed by 3 overnight frosts, but still there. The carved stamps work, still legible, pad marks and claw spacing and the stride length she had measured from observation. She looked at them. Then she took a step forward, off the trail, into the soft ground beside it, and she shifted. It was easier this time. Not easy in the sense of effortless. She thought it was probably never going to be exactly effortless, not for her, not in the early period of this. But easier in the sense that she knew where the door was now, and how it opened, and the particular quality of release that meant it was opening right. She went from herself to the wolf in the time it took her to breathe in and let the breath go, and she was on the ground, and the forest was the other version of itself. The version that had always been here. She pressed her paw into the mud beside the old stamp prints and held it there for a moment, feeling the cold of the ground, the soft give of it after the rains. Then she lifted it. She looked at the 2 prints side by side. The stamp's print and hers. They were close. She had been a precise carpenter and she had calibrated carefully, and the difference was not dramatic, but it was there. Her real print was slightly wider across the pads, slightly deeper in the center, with a particular angle to the right front claw that was hers, and not the stamp's, because the stamp could only be a single form and she was not a single form. She was specific. She was the actual thing, and the actual thing was always slightly different from its approximation. She found this funny. She could not have explained exactly why she found it funny. She was a wolf in the mud at 2 in the morning examining the technical quality of her own forgery, and it was funny in the way that things were funny when they revealed exactly the shape of the absurdity you had been living inside. She had spent 3 years making these prints as accurate as she could. She had measured and calibrated and refined. And the actual print, the real one, the one she was looking at now, was better, obviously better, undeniably hers. She did not know what to do with funny right now. She sat with it. She shifted back and stood in the mud and looked at both prints, the stamps and hers, for a moment. The stamps, faded and frost-softened and 10 days old. Hers, fresh, precise, warm still at the edges where the ground had given. She reached into the pocket of her jacket. She did not have the stamp with her. The stamp was in the kitchen drawer. She had known when she left the house that it was not coming with her, and she had not needed to deliberate about this. It was simply a decision that had already been made, in the clearing, or in the garden room, or in the moment she had looked at the grass and seen her own marks in it beside the king's crouched form. The pocket was empty. She took her hand back out. She looked at the 2 prints one more time. Then she turned and walked home. She walked home through the birch trees, which were white in the dark in the way they were white in the morning, which was a constant she found genuinely comforting, and she thought about the shape of the next days. The review would end tomorrow. The king's party would begin preparations to leave the following morning. She had the logistics of their departure to coordinate, which was straightforward. She had done it in reverse and she knew what it required. She had lists for it. She did not know what happened after the departure. She understood that the review would produce a formal record, and that the formal record would describe the pack's composition accurately, and that her name would appear in it as a confirmed member with active status, and that this was different from any record that had existed about her before. She understood that Dr. Wren's report would be part of that record, and that the report would say what it said, and that the saying of it was the first time anyone with formal authority had put accurate words to her situation in an official document. She understood that the words in that document changed what was possible. Not immediately, not in a way that would be visible from the outside on any given Tuesday, but it changed the architecture of things. It changed what could be built in the space where her maintained fiction had been, because the fiction had required a kind of constant bracing, a structural tension that held the shape of the thing she was pretending to be, and now that the fiction was gone, the tension was gone, and what was left was just the actual space. She did not know what to build in the actual space. She thought she might need some time before she knew. She went home. She made tea. She stood at the kitchen window with the mug in both hands and looked at the dark outside, which was the dark of her usual 2 in the morning and therefore familiar. And she thought about the last few weeks in the measured way. She thought about things when the immediate crisis had passed, and she was in the recovery period before the next decision. She looked at the kitchen drawer. She opened it. The stamp was there, beside the folded letter and the spare keys, and the notebook she kept for numbers she needed to remember. She picked it up and turned it over in her hands. She had made this when she was 21. She had made it with her kitchen knife and a piece of scrap oak from the woodpile, working by the light of the one lamp she kept on the kitchen table in the evenings. She had made it the week after she watched Peter leave, and she had finished it in a single night, which was unusual for her. She was methodical and she did not rush work. But that night she had worked with an urgency that was not exactly fear and not exactly anger, and was probably the place where those 2 things overlapped when they were moving in the same direction. She had been 21 and alone, and certain that what she was would cost her everything. She set the stamp back in the drawer. She closed it. She stood at the kitchen table for a moment, her hand still on the drawer handle. The thing she had built with that stamp, the fiction, the ongoing performance, the twice-weekly maintenance of a version of herself that matched what the pack expected, had kept her here. She would not pretend otherwise. She would not look back at the last 3 years and decide that they had been unnecessary because they had been necessary. They had been the thing between her and Peter's outcome. But they were done. And she was still here. She was still here, and the stamp was in the drawer, and she had shifted twice in one afternoon in an autumn garden with the Alpha King watching, and she was still here. She thought this was probably the thing she could not quite process yet. Not the shifting, she would process the shifting in stages. She knew this about herself. The large things always happened in stages. She was not a person who had large realizations and absorbed them all at once. She would wake up tomorrow and the day after and the week after, and she would continue to find out what this was. No, the thing she could not quite process was the stillness. The stillness where the bracing had been, the structural tension of the fiction which had been so constant for so long that she had simply integrated it, the way you stopped noticing the sound of water if you lived close enough to a river. It was always there. She had always been managing it, always had the part of her attention that was tracking the fiction and maintaining it and watching for the place where it might fail. That was gone. She was standing in her kitchen at 2 in the morning, and the part of her that had always been watching was not watching anything. She did not know what to do with the quiet. She thought she would probably learn. She sat down at the kitchen table. She thought about Fletcher. She thought about what he had said to her before she went into the garden room. 8 seconds, he had said, and it had been 8 seconds, and it had been the most accurately targeted 8 seconds anyone had ever aimed in her direction. She thought about the fact that she had not accepted his offer and had not withdrawn it either, and about the nature of things that stayed on the table when you left them there. She thought about the Alpha King. She thought about his voice, low and clear, at the edge of the forest. She thought about the way he had straightened and watched her without adding anything to what he had said, without managing her reaction to it. She thought about what that quality was, the quality of not managing someone's reaction, and she thought that the word for it was respect, except it was a quieter and more specific form of respect than the word usually carried, the respect of trusting someone to receive a true thing. She had never been given that before. She would not pretend it did not matter. She thought about the morning, the review's final day. She would see him in the context of the formal closing, a brief ceremony, acknowledgement of the host pack, the traditional departure courtesies. She would see him across a room and she would be on one side of the logistics of his departure and he would be on the other, and they would not speak the way they had spoken in the garden. She thought that she might be all right with that. She was surprised to find that she thought she might be all right with that. She had prepared, somewhere in the back of her mind, for the possibility that the afternoon in the garden would be the kind of thing that produced a particular type of entanglement, the kind that came from being seen clearly by someone unexpected, and finding the experience of it transformative enough to make you believe that the person doing the seeing was themselves exceptional rather than that the thing being seen was yours all along. She was not going to make that mistake. He had not said anything to her that she had not already known. He had said it more plainly than she had ever let herself say it, and he had said it in a moment when her defenses were not positioned to redirect it, and the result was that she had heard it, finally, at a depth that made it land. But the truth of it, the pack not being worth showing herself to, the holding, the 24 years of meticulous construction, that was not something he had given her. It was something she had been carrying, and he had simply declined to help her carry it any further. That was the gift. Not him, the space he had made by declining. She would remember the difference. She finished her tea, she washed the mug. She went to the window one more time and looked at the dark outside and thought about the owl leaving, how it went from there to not there without announcement, and she thought about what it felt like to be the space where something had been before the new thing arrived. She thought she had been that space for a long time. She was ready for the new thing. In the morning, she went to work. The final day of the review was everything a final day of anything was, the concentrated completion of tasks that had been in progress, the filing of the last forms, the coordination of the last logistics. She moved through it with the efficiency that was genuinely hers, that had always been genuinely hers, and she did not perform it or manage it or maintain it. She just did her job. The formal closing was at 2 in the afternoon. The pack assembled in the main hall, not the outdoor field, a smaller, warmer internal gathering. The Alpha King stood with Garrett and spoke briefly about what the review had found, which was what she had expected him to say, and was honest in the plain way he was always honest. Good health in the pack, strong territory, clear management, a community that knew what it was. She stood in the back of the hall, not the fourth row, the actual back, leaning against the wall with her arms loose at her sides, listening. She caught Owen Greer's eye across the room. He looked at her. She looked back at him. He gave her the briefest of nods, the same nod from the market square, the same held moment of recognition but different in its content now. Before, it had been a nod that said, "I saw what I saw and I am not going to say it." Now it was a nod that said, I saw what I saw and it is exactly what it is. The difference between an omission and a fact. She nodded back. The formal closing ended. The hall began to move in the unhurried way of gatherings dispersing. She stayed against the wall. The king moved through the hall in the process of departure, accepting the formal courtesies, speaking briefly with pack members, completing the visible end of the review. He moved toward the main doors. He passed her side of the hall. He stopped. She looked at him. He looked at her. He said nothing. She said nothing. Then he held out his hand. She looked at it for a moment. She shook it. His hand was warm and the grip was brief and entirely professional, and she felt nothing dramatic in it, which was correct, which was how it should be, which she was grateful for in a specific way that she would probably think about later. Your supply office is impressively organized, he said. She almost laughed. Thank you, she said. I mean it, he said. The accommodation was handled perfectly. I made a note of the discrepancy in the fuel delivery schedules, she said. I'll send the correction to the Aldrich Administrative Office with the review follow-up paperwork. I'll make sure it gets to the right person, he said. He released her hand. He walked toward the main doors. He went out. She stayed against the wall for a moment. Then she pushed off it and walked through the hall toward the supply office, because there was follow-up paperwork, and she wanted to have it started before the end of the day, and the fuel discrepancy correction was not going to file itself. Fletcher was in the corridor. He had been somewhere in the hall during the closing, and she had not tracked exactly where, and now he was in the corridor outside the supply office, leaning against the wall with his hands in his pockets in the way he stood when he was waiting for something he was not sure was coming. She stopped. She looked at him. The offer, she said. He waited. I'm not going to accept it, she said. I want to be direct about that. Not because it wasn't the right kind of offering, or because I don't understand what it was, but because it was a solution to a problem that I don't have anymore, and I'm not in the habit of keeping solutions to problems I've solved. He looked at her for a long moment. All right, he said. That doesn't mean, she stopped. She thought about how to say the next thing with the precision it required. The 8 months, she said. The check marks, what you said before I went in, I'm not putting any of that down. I'm just putting it somewhere different than where it's been. He was quiet. Where, he said. Somewhere I know where it is, she said. He looked at the wall beside her. He looked back at her. He nodded. She unlocked the supply office door. She went in. She sat at her desk. She opened the ledger to the fuel discrepancy she had been tracking for the past week, and she began to write up the correction for the Aldrich Administrative Office. Halfway through the letter, she stopped. She looked at her hands on the desk. They were her hands, the same hands they had always been. She had looked at them in the garden and they had been different, and then they had been hers again, and the gap between those two states, the gap she had been trying to cross for 24 years, was no longer a gap. It was just the natural motion between two forms of the same person. She turned them over once, palms up, and looked at them. Then she set them back on the desk and finished the letter. She had the correction filed, and the follow-up paperwork started before the end of the day. She locked up the office. She walked home through the birch trees. The white of the bark was the same white it always was, and it did the same thing to the inside of her chest that it always did, and she let it. She went home. The kitchen drawer was closed. She left it closed. She made dinner and ate it at the kitchen table, and the stamp was in the drawer, and the letter was in the drawer, and the spare keys were in the drawer, and she did not open it, and she did not need to. She was here. She had always been here. That, it turned out, had always been enough. She just had not believed it until someone declined to help her pretend otherwise. Outside, the birch trees were white in the dark, and the border trail wound along the edge of the territory the way it always had, and the paw prints she had left in the mud that morning were already filling with new rain, gently, the way the earth covered things that had served their purpose. Letting them go. Making room.